You know the feeling. Something happens, a comment, a look, a message you weren't expecting, and before you can think, you're already somewhere else. Heart hammering. Jaw tight. Saying something you'll spend the next 3 days replaying. Or maybe it goes the other way, you go completely silent when you needed to speak. You shut down in the meeting, checked out of the conversation, smiled and said I'm fine while something in you was quietly drowning. You didn't choose any of that. It just happened. And afterward, you were left wondering why you can't seem to stay in control of the one thing that's supposed to be most yours, your own inner world. You're intelligent. You're capable. You've read things, tried things, told yourself to do better. And still the same patterns come back, in the same situations, with the same people, wearing the same tired face. There is a reason for that. And there is a way through it that actually works, not willpower, not positive thinking, but a genuine understanding of how emotions are made and what you can do with that knowledge. This book is about exactly that. Not suppressing what you feel. Understanding it so deeply that it stops running you. Stay with me. Introduction: the most important skill nobody taught you. Think about everything you were taught in school. You learned to read and write, to solve equations, to memorize the dates of battles and the names of rivers. If you were lucky, someone taught you a second language, the basics of chemistry, how to analyze a poem, how to format a resume. Somewhere along the way, educators decided what knowledge mattered, what would prepare you for the world, and they built an entire system around delivering it. Not once, in most people's entire education, did anyone sit down and teach them how to handle what goes on inside their own chest. Nobody explained what anger actually is, or why it arrives without invitation and leaves damage in its wake. Nobody taught you what to do when grief shows up at 2 a.m. and refuses to leave. No class covered the mechanics of anxiety, why the dread before a difficult conversation feels as real and physical as a wound, or how to stop your thoughts from spiraling when something goes wrong. You were expected to figure all of that out on your own. Most people never quite do. This is one of the stranger gaps in modern civilization. We live in an age of extraordinary knowledge. We have mapped the human genome, sent machines to the edge of the solar system, and built networks that connect billions of people in real time. We have developed sophisticated frameworks for nearly every domain of human performance: medicine, engineering, finance, athletics, management. And yet the majority of adults walk through their days largely at the mercy of their emotional lives, reacting instead of responding, suppressing instead of processing, misreading their own inner states and making decisions they later can't explain. The cost of this gap is enormous and almost entirely invisible. It's paid out in damaged relationships, in derailed careers, in health problems tied to chronic stress, in the chronic low-grade suffering of people who are intelligent and capable in almost every external dimension but who have never learned to navigate their own inner world. The gap is paid in arguments that escalate past the point of reason, in people who feel lonelier in their relationships than they did alone, in the weight of carrying emotions that have nowhere to go. This book exists to close that gap. The hidden cost of not knowing it would be easier if emotional dysregulation announced itself clearly, if it came with an obvious label and an obvious cost. But it doesn't work that way. The costs are diffuse, often invisible, and typically attributed to other causes. The relationship that ends is blamed on incompatibility, not on the reactive patterns that slowly eroded trust. The career derailment is attributed to politics or bad luck, not to the difficulty managing frustration and anxiety that made certain situations unnavigable. The physical health problems that accumulate, the tension headaches, the gut trouble, the immune system failures during high-stress periods, are treated as separate from emotional life, even when they're expressions of the same unprocessed activation. The person living these costs doesn't usually connect them to a single source. They experience them as separate misfortunes, a streak of bad luck, a personality trait that's just how they are, a series of difficult circumstances. The possibility that a single underlying skill gap, the gap between the emotional life they have and the emotional life they have capacity to build, is the common thread is not always visible until someone points it out directly. That's what this book is for. Not to blame you for the costs you've already paid. Not to suggest that emotional dysregulation is your fault, or that the patterns you carry are a character failure. But to show you, as clearly and practically as possible, that there is a single skill, the skill of understanding and navigating your emotional life, that underlies almost every domain where your inner world has created difficulty. And that this skill, unlike many, can be deliberately learned. What this book is not before you know what this book is, it matters to be clear about what it isn't, because there is a lot of problematic material in the emotional wellness space, and you deserve to know up front that this isn't that. This book is not about suppressing your emotions. The goal is not to become someone who doesn't get rattled, who maintains a serene smile in the face of loss or injustice, who rises above their feelings by refusing to feel them. That approach doesn't work. Decades of psychological research have confirmed it, and it tends to produce people who are either secretly miserable or occasionally explosive or both. Suppression is not mastery. It is delay with interest. The emotions you refuse to feel don't disappear. They accumulate, and they find their own way out. This book is not toxic positivity. You will not be told to focus on the good when something genuinely hard is happening, or that your emotions are just mindset problems that can be corrected with gratitude journaling and a better morning routine. Your difficult emotions are not mistakes. They are signals. They are your nervous system's attempt to communicate something real about your situation and your needs. The task is not to replace those signals with cheerier ones, it's to understand what they're communicating, so you can respond to what's actually happening rather than what you'd prefer to be happening. This book is not therapy in disguise. If you're dealing with clinical depression, trauma, PTSD, or another condition that requires professional treatment, please seek that treatment. This book will not pretend to replace it. What this book offers is a practical education, the foundational knowledge about emotional life that should have been standard curriculum but wasn't. It is designed for the vast majority of people who are functioning but struggling, who are intelligent but frustrated with themselves, who sense there's something they're missing about how emotions work and what to do with them. This book is not abstract philosophy. It will not spend much time on why emotions are meaningful in some cosmic sense. It will spend most of its time on something more immediately useful, how emotions actually work, at the level of neuroscience and psychology, what goes wrong in the patterns that most commonly create suffering, and what you can do about it specifically, practically, and starting immediately. And this book is not a shortcut. Building emotional intelligence requires real change in the nervous system, change that happens through practice, not through insight alone. The knowledge in these pages matters, but only insofar as it leads to action. If you read this book and find it interesting but don't use any of it, your emotional life will look exactly the same 6 months from now as it does today. The value here is entirely proportional to how much of it you actually live. What this book is a practical system for understanding, navigating, and using your emotional life as a source of intelligence rather than a source of chaos. By the time you finish it, you'll understand how emotions are actually constructed in the brain and why that knowledge is the beginning of real agency over your inner life. You'll understand what your nervous system is doing when it activates, what evolutionary logic is driving the responses that feel so irrational in modern contexts, and why certain situations reliably push you above the threshold of regulated response. You'll be able to identify your own emotional patterns with accuracy, not just I get anxious or I have a temper, but a precise map of when you dysregulate, what triggers it, what it costs you, and what specifically helps. You'll have a set of tools that are grounded in real neuroscience and psychology, not motivational shortcuts, not platitudes dressed up as techniques, but actual methods that change the way your nervous system responds to difficulty. You'll understand why those tools work at a mechanistic level, which will help you apply them more effectively and trust them enough to use them in the moments when you most need to. And you'll have a structured protocol, 3 of them, leveled for different starting points, that you can use to begin building the emotional intelligence that no one bothered to teach you. Most fundamentally, this is a book about becoming, in the truest sense, more yourself. Not the version of you that acts before thinking, that shuts down under pressure, that carries unexpressed emotion until it finds its own way out. The version of you who can be fully present with what's happening inside and out and still choose how to respond. The version of you who moves through your emotional life with something that is not the absence of feeling, but the deep and practical literacy of it. How the book is structured: the book moves in 3 parts, each building on the last. Part 1, Understanding, chapters 1 through 3, covers the foundations. What emotions actually are, at a neurological and psychological level that most people have never been given. Why your brain generates emotions and what evolutionary logic underlies the responses that often feel so disproportionate or irrational in modern contexts. And how to diagnose your own emotional patterns, which of 4 distinct profiles of dysregulation is your dominant one, and why the answer matters for everything that follows. You can't change something you don't understand, and most people have never been given an accurate picture of how their emotional system works. That changes in Part 1. Part 2, Common Failures, chapters 4 through 6, examines the 2 most costly emotional problems in contemporary life. Chapter 4 covers reactivity, the pattern of responses that are too fast, too intense, and too expensive in their aftermath. Chapter 5 covers suppression, the pattern of pushing emotions down instead of processing them, and the accumulated costs that this produces in both psychological and physical health. Chapter 6 looks at how both patterns play out in the place where emotional dysregulation does the most damage for most people, their relationships. This section is where you will most likely recognize yourself, sometimes uncomfortably. That recognition is not a problem. It is the starting point of change. Part 3, The Reset, chapters 7 through 10, is where the work happens. 3-leveled protocols, designed for different starting points and different depths of change, a 7-day awareness practice for those building the foundation for the first time, a 21-day regulation system for those ready to build active skills on top of existing awareness, and a 30-day emotional architecture rebuilt for those whose patterns are deeply ingrained and require more substantial structural change. Chapter 10 covers what comes after, how to sustain what you build, how to recognize when you're drifting back into old patterns, and what the long-term relationship with your emotional life can look like. A word before you begin: you are not broken. Whatever has brought you to this book, an outburst you still regret, years of emotional numbness that have cost you in ways you can feel but can't fully name, relationships that keep breaking down at the same points regardless of how much you want them to work, anxiety that won't quiet down, a vague but persistent sense that you are living at some distance from your own inner life, none of it means there is something fundamentally wrong with you. It means you were never given the tools. The emotional patterns you carry were shaped by everything that happened before you had the language or the awareness to examine them. Your early environment, the emotional models around you, the experiences that taught you, without anyone explicitly saying so, what feelings were safe to have and which ones had to be hidden or managed or converted into something more acceptable. You didn't choose those patterns. You absorbed them, the way children absorb everything. Before you were old enough to evaluate what you were absorbing. But the patterns that were absorbed without choice can be changed by choice, not instantly, not without effort, and not without a period of genuine discomfort as the old system encounters something different. That's not a discouragement. That's an accurate description of how real change works. And the people who have done this work, who have moved from a mostly unconscious relationship with their emotional life to a mostly deliberate one, consistently describe it as among the most valuable things they've ever done. This book won't do the work for you. Reading it will not be enough. The knowledge matters, but only insofar as it leads to practice, and practice, specifically deliberate practice in emotional awareness and regulation, is what actually rewires the brain over time. There are reflection exercises at the end of each chapter and structured protocols in Part 3. Use them. Not perfectly, not all at once, not with the goal of doing them correctly. Use them with the goal of actually engaging, of bringing your real emotional life into contact with the material, rather than reading about emotional life from a comfortable distance. You have carried the weight of an unexamined emotional life for long enough. Something in you knew that, which is why you're here. Let's begin. Practical reflection: sit with these 3 questions before moving into Chapter 1. Write your answers if you can, not because they need to be profound or well articulated, but because the act of writing slows your thinking enough to be genuinely honest. The quick, polished answer is almost never the true one. Give yourself time to arrive at something real. What emotion do you find most difficult to handle, either in yourself, when you feel it, or when it's directed at you by someone else? What does it do to you when that emotion arrives? Think of a specific recent moment when your emotional response cost you something: a relationship, an opportunity, your own peace of mind, your own self-respect. What happened, and what do you wish had been different? What would genuinely change in your daily life if you had complete confidence in your ability to navigate your own emotional world, to feel fully without being controlled by what you feel? You don't need to answer these perfectly. You just need to start looking. That looking is the beginning of what this book is for. Chapter 1: What Emotions Actually Are. In 1995, a neuroscientist named Lisa Feldman Barrett was running what should have been a straightforward study on anxiety and sadness. She had recruited participants, shown them emotionally evocative stimuli, and asked them to report what they felt. The data came back, and it was a mess, not because the participants were unreliable, but because she had assumed that anxiety and sadness would be clearly distinct emotional states, and they weren't. People reported overlapping sensations. The physiological signals crossed. The categories blurred. Barrett spent the next 2 decades trying to understand why, and in the process she dismantled one of the most deeply held assumptions in the science of emotion, an assumption so fundamental that most people never question it, because it feels like simple common sense. The assumption is this: that emotions are real things that happen to you. That somewhere in the brain there are circuits for fear and anger and sadness and joy, and when the right trigger appears, those circuits fire, and the emotion erupts into consciousness, involuntary, automatic, hardwired into our biology. This view, what Barrett calls the classical theory of emotion, suggests that every emotion has a distinct fingerprint in the brain and body, that an emotion like fear looks more or less the same in every person who feels it, and that our job, when an emotion arrives, is essentially to manage something that has happened to us from the outside in. It's a reasonable sounding model. It's also, Barrett argues, largely wrong. And the wrongness matters, because the strategies you use to manage your emotions are built on top of your theory of what they are. If the theory is inaccurate, the strategies will be, at best, partially effective. At worst, they'll be working directly against you. The history of a wrong idea. The classical view of emotion has a long history in science, philosophy, and common sense. Charles Darwin, in his 1872 book, The Expression of Emotions in Man and Animals, argued that emotions are universal, innate, and evolutionarily conserved, that the expression of fear or anger in a human being is fundamentally similar to the expression of those states in other animals, because the underlying biological circuits are the same. Paul Ekman, a psychologist whose work in the 1960s and 70s became extraordinarily influential, built on this foundation by arguing that there are 6 basic emotions: happiness, sadness, fear, anger, disgust, and surprise, that are universally expressed and recognized across all human cultures. His research with isolated tribal communities in New Guinea seemed to confirm this. Even people who had no contact with Western culture recognized and produced the same facial expressions for the same emotional states. The clinical and popular implications of Ekman's work were enormous. If emotions are hardwired and universal, then the goal of emotion management is clear: learn to recognize the emotion, and then find ways to modulate the automatic response. This is the framework behind most popular emotional intelligence training, behind much of cognitive behavioral therapy's early formulations, and behind the intuitive way most people think about their feelings. The problem is that subsequent research has been considerably less supportive of this view than its proponents suggested. Cross-cultural studies have found that facial expressions are far less universally readable than Ekman's research implied. Context matters enormously, and what looks like one emotion in one cultural setting may look like a different emotion in another. Brain imaging studies have repeatedly failed to find the discrete, emotion-specific neural circuits that the classical model requires. Fear doesn't have a single neural fingerprint. Neither does anger, or sadness, or joy. The patterns that show up in brain scans during emotional experience are varied, distributed, and context-dependent in ways that resist the neat categorization the classical model predicts. This is the scientific ground that Barrett's decades of research has been turning over, and what she has found, and documented in her landmark 2017 book, How Emotions Are Made, is that the classical view needs to be substantially revised. Emotions are not reactions, they are predictions. The brain is not a passive receiver of information from the world. It is an extraordinarily active prediction machine. Every moment of your waking life, your brain is generating predictions, guesses about what's happening in the world and in your body, based on what has happened before. The brain creates a model of reality and then uses incoming sensory data to correct it, rather than building an accurate picture from scratch each time. This is deeply counterintuitive. We feel like our perceptions are direct responses to what's actually there, that we see the apple because the apple is there, that we feel the cold because the temperature is cold. But what you're actually experiencing, moment to moment, is your brain's best prediction of what's happening, continuously updated by sensory input. Most of the time the prediction is accurate enough that you'd never notice, When it's wrong, you notice immediately, which is why optical illusions work, why you startle at a shadow that turns out to be a coat on a chair, why your grief can suddenly hit full force when you're reading something completely unrelated. Emotions are part of this prediction system. They are not responses to reality, they are your brain's attempt to make sense of your body's internal state, based on past experience, and to prepare you for what it predicts is about to happen. The technical term for this is interoceptive prediction, the brain monitoring signals from inside the body, heart rate, breathing, muscle tension, gut activity, and constructing an interpretation of those signals that we experience as emotion. What this means, at the most foundational level, is that emotions are constructed. They are not given to you by the world, they are made by you, by your brain, using the raw material of physiological sensation filtered through a lifetime of learning and experience. The sensation of your heart beating faster doesn't come pre-labeled. Your brain has to decide what it means. And the decision it makes anxious or excited, threatened or energized is based on patterns learned from every previous time it encountered a similar physiological state in a similar context. The concept of constructed emotion. Barrett developed what she calls the theory of constructed emotion, and it shifts the entire framework for thinking about what emotional mastery means. In the classical model, emotions are like reflexes, they happen to you, and managing them means finding ways to control or dampen the response. In the constructionist model, emotions are predictions, they're made by you, even if that making happens below conscious awareness. Which means that the system that makes them can, with awareness and practice, be changed. Consider what this means practically. If you grew up in an environment where conflict was loud and threatening, where raised voices meant danger, your brain learned to label certain physiological states, elevated heart rate, bodily tension, heightened alertness, as fear or threat when they occur in contexts involving interpersonal conflict. Even in situations where you're actually safe, that learned construction continues to fire. The physiological state is real. The interpretation your brain places on it is learned. And learned things can be unlearned, or more precisely, supplemented and overridden by new learning. This is why emotional mastery is not about not feeling. It's not about having fewer emotional responses or achieving some state of inner calm that sits above the messiness of a human life. It's about understanding how your emotions are made so you can begin to participate in that process rather than simply being subject to it. The common misconception, debunked. The popular understanding of emotions tends to go something like this: something happens, the emotion fires automatically, and then the rational mind steps in to deal with it. In this model, the emotional system is primitive, impulsive, and often inconvenient, the thing you have to overcome to think clearly. The goal of emotional management, in this frame, is essentially to get the rational brain back in charge. This model is not just oversimplified, it leads directly to strategies that don't work. If emotions are simply primitive reflexes, then the way to manage them is to override them, suppress them, or push through them. And if you've ever tried that approach, you know what happens. The emotion doesn't go away. It goes underground and finds other exits. Barrett's research, along with the work of other researchers in affective neuroscience, shows that the distinction between emotional and rational brain is not how the brain actually works. The prefrontal cortex, the part associated with planning, reasoning, and decision-making, is deeply involved in generating emotional experience, not separate from it. Emotion is not the opposite of cognition. Emotion is a form of cognition. It is one of the ways your brain computes what matters, what to prioritize, and how to respond. The question is not how to turn it off. The question is how to make the system more accurate. The brain's emotional predictions become less accurate when the concepts it uses to interpret physiological states are coarse, limited, or outdated. A person with a rich emotional vocabulary who can distinguish between frustration and disappointment, between nervousness and dread, between warmth and tenderness has more granular concepts to work with, and their brain makes more precise predictions. A person who experiences most difficult states simply as feeling bad is working with a blunt instrument. And blunt instruments produce blunt, imprecise behavior. This is why one of the most powerful interventions in emotional intelligence is something as simple as expanding your emotional vocabulary, not as a touchy-feely exercise, but as a way of giving your brain more accurate categories to construct experience with. The more specifically you can name what you feel, the more specifically your brain can understand and respond to it. Barrett calls this emotional granularity, and research consistently shows that people with high emotional granularity cope better with stress, regulate more effectively, and make better decisions under pressure. What emotional mastery actually means given everything above? Emotional mastery means something more interesting and more attainable than it might first appear. It doesn't mean never being overwhelmed. It doesn't mean achieving permanent equanimity or training yourself to stay calm in situations that genuinely warrant a stronger response. It doesn't mean eliminating the emotions that make life difficult, because those emotions carry information about what you value, what threatens you, what you've lost, what you need. Eliminating them would mean eliminating the signal, and the signal is the point. What emotional mastery means, in the constructionist frame, is developing awareness of how your emotions are being made, the physiological states that fuel them, the conceptual categories that shape them, the past experiences that inform them, and developing enough flexibility in that system that you're not locked into only one possible construction of any given situation. It means building what researchers call emotion differentiation, the ability to distinguish between states that might superficially feel similar but are actually different. It means developing interoceptive awareness, the ability to notice and accurately read your body's internal signals, rather than having them processed entirely below consciousness where you have no access to them. It means updating the brain's predictions by accumulating new experiences that don't match the old patterns, not through affirmations, but through actually doing things differently and letting the brain register the outcome. The chapters ahead will build this understanding layer by layer. But the foundation is what you've just read. Your emotions are not happening to you from outside. They are constructed by you, from the inside out. That is not a comforting abstraction. It is the most practically useful thing you can know about emotional life, because it means the system is not fixed. It means you have more agency than you've probably been told. And it means that change, real change in how you experience and navigate your emotional world, is genuinely possible. The social construction of emotion. Barrett's research also illuminates something important and underappreciated. Emotion is not only a biological phenomenon. It is also a social and cultural one. The emotional concepts you have available to you, the categories your brain uses to construct emotional experience, were learned from your social environment. You didn't invent the concept of embarrassment from scratch. You absorbed it from your culture, from the reactions of the people around you when you did something that violated social norms, from the language people used to describe those situations, from stories and media that depicted that state and labeled it. The concept became part of your emotional vocabulary, and once it did, your brain could construct embarrassment as an experience, because it had a category to construct it into. This is why emotional experience varies somewhat across cultures. Cultures with different emotional concepts produce people who have different emotional experiences, not just different expressions of the same underlying states, but genuinely different constructions of those states. The Japanese concept of ame, a pleasant feeling of dependence and indulgence in a close relationship, describes an experience that most English speakers can recognize when described but don't have a native emotional category for. The German Schadenfreude of pleasure at someone else's misfortune is a concept that, once you have it, allows you to notice and name an experience that you probably had before the word arrived, but couldn't quite see clearly. The concept sharpens the perception. This has a powerful practical implication. You can deliberately expand your emotional experience by expanding your emotional concepts. Learning new words for emotional states, reading literature that inhabits the inner lives of people different from you, engaging with people whose emotional vocabularies and traditions differ from your own, all of these are not simply intellectual exercises. They are, in a very real sense, expanding the range of experience available to you. They give your brain more categories to construct experience with, which means more accurate, more differentiated, and ultimately more workable emotional perception. Why this changes everything. Understanding that emotions are constructions, not fixed reflexes, changes the fundamental relationship between you and your inner life. In the classical model, emotions are things that happen to you, your job is to endure them, manage them, or overcome them. In the constructionist model, emotions are things you make, your job is to understand the process by which they're made, so you can participate in that process more skillfully. This is not a small shift. It is the difference between being a passenger and being a driver. The passenger can influence the journey somewhat, they can request a different route, complain about the speed, but fundamentally, they are subject to decisions made elsewhere. The driver doesn't control everything, the road conditions, the traffic, the weather, but they make the fundamental choices about direction, speed, and response to what arises. The driver's seat is not a place of perfect control. It's a place of greater agency. And agency is what emotional mastery is actually about. Consider what happens when someone criticizes your work. The physiological response. The quickening of the heart, the flush of heat, the momentary freezing, is real and immediate. But what that response becomes, whether it gets constructed into shame, or defensiveness, or anger, or hurt, or curiosity about where the criticism is coming from, is a construction. And constructions, unlike reflexes, can be influenced. Not instantly, not through sheer willpower, but through the accumulation of awareness, vocabulary, and deliberate experience that gradually gives the brain new options for what to make of ambiguous physiological states. This is the foundation on which everything else in this book is built. The tools and practices that follow, the awareness protocols, the regulation techniques, the relationship practices, all work within this framework. They are not about overcoming your emotions. They are about developing a more accurate, more flexible, more skilled relationship with the process by which your emotions are made. Practical reflections sit with the idea that your emotions are predictions, not fixed reactions, and let it move from intellectual understanding into personal territory. Choose one emotion you experience regularly, one that feels automatic, like it just happens to you, and try to trace it backward. Think of a recent time it appeared. What was the physiological state underneath it? What did your body feel? What was the context? What past experience might have taught your brain to construct the situation as this particular emotion? You're not looking for a neat answer. You're looking for the beginning of curiosity about a system you've been living inside without examining. Second, spend one day paying attention to how precisely you name your emotional states. When you notice something arising, resist the general word stressed, bad, upset, and push for specificity. Were you irritated or humiliated? Disappointed or betrayed? Anxious or uncertain? The practice will feel uncomfortable at first because the words won't come easily. That discomfort is telling you something accurate about where your emotional vocabulary currently lives. That's useful information. That's where the work begins. Chapter 2: Why Your Brain Generates Emotions. About 300,000 years ago, on the savannas of what is now East Africa, a human ancestor heard a sound in the tall grass. The sound was ambiguous. It could have been wind, or it could have been a predator. In the fraction of a second before any conscious thought was possible, their body was already responding, heart rate climbing, pupils dilating, muscles tensing, attention narrowing to a sharp point. They were ready to run or fight before they had formed a single deliberate intention. The ones who felt that response strongly, and who acted on it quickly, tended to survive. The ones who were more relaxed about ambiguous rustling in the grass tended to get eaten. You are descended from the people who felt fear. Not a mild sense of unease, genuine, fast, full-body fear. The emotional system that produced that response is, in its essential architecture, the system you are carrying right now. It is millions of years of survival engineering, and it is extraordinarily effective at the thing it evolved to do. The problem is that you are not living on a savanna. You are sitting in a meeting, or driving in traffic, or reading a message on your phone, and the same system that kept your ancestors alive is generating threat responses to situations that do not, in any meaningful sense, require you to run or fight. Understanding why the emotional system works the way it does is the first step to working with it rather than against it. The evolutionary logic of emotions did not evolve as experiences. They evolved as action systems. Before the brain developed the capacity for the kind of reflective consciousness that asks, "How am I feeling?" it had developed circuits that generated rapid, coordinated responses to survival-relevant situations. Fear existed not so you could know you were afraid, it existed so you would move away from danger. Anger existed not to be felt, it existed so you would fight back against threats to your status, territory, or offspring. Disgust existed not as an aesthetic experience, it existed so you would avoid rotting food and contaminated water. Every core emotion was, at its evolutionary root, a behavioral program, a fast, automatic mobilization of the body toward survival-relevant action. What we experience as emotion, the felt quality of it, the consciousness of being in an emotional state is, in evolutionary terms, a relatively recent addition. The action systems came first. The awareness came later. This sequence matters because it means that much of what drives emotional behavior operates below conscious access. The body is already moving before the mind has named what's happening. The decision to approach or avoid, to attack or submit, to connect or withdraw is substantially made before you've had a chance to weigh it. This isn't a design flaw. In environments where decisions needed to happen in milliseconds, slow deliberate reasoning would have been a death sentence. Speed mattered more than nuance. Fast and approximately right was infinitely better than slow and precisely right. The emotional system is a fast approximate right system that has been doing its job extremely well for a very long time. The design flaw, if you want to call it that, is the mismatch between the environment the system was designed for and the environment you actually live in. The threats that shaped your emotional hardware were largely physical and immediate: predators, rival groups, starvation, injury. The threats that populate modern life are largely social and abstract: rejection, humiliation, financial uncertainty, status anxiety, existential worry. Your nervous system cannot reliably tell the difference. To the subcortical threat detection circuits in your brain, a critical performance review and a charging lion activate similar responses. One of them warrants an adrenaline surge. The other, generally, does not. The limbic system and the prefrontal cortex. When people talk about the emotional brain, they're often referring to the limbic system, a set of structures that includes the amygdala, hippocampus, hypothalamus, and several related regions. The amygdala in particular has become the popular shorthand for emotional reactivity. It's often described as the brain's alarm system, the structure that detects threat and triggers the fight or flight response. This is broadly accurate, though like most neuroscience oversimplifications, it misses important nuance. The amygdala doesn't simply detect threats, it detects salience, which means things that matter, whether positively or negatively. It's involved in processing fear, yes, but also desire, excitement, and attachment. What it's really doing is flagging things that require attention and response, and communicating urgency to the rest of the brain. The prefrontal cortex is the region most associated with reasoning, planning, and impulse control. It's the part of the brain that allows you to think about consequences, weigh options, and inhibit immediate impulses when they're not adaptive. In simplified pop psychology, the prefrontal cortex is the rational brain trying to contain the emotional brain. The reality is considerably more integrated. The prefrontal cortex and limbic structures are in constant bidirectional communication, and emotion is not simply the output of one region any more than language is the output of a single word. What is true is that when the amygdala detects high threat, it can effectively reduce the functional influence of the prefrontal cortex, the state that Daniel Goleman famously described as an amygdala hijack. In states of acute emotional arousal, the brain's priority shifts from deliberate reasoning to rapid response. You become, in those moments, more reactive and less reflective. You have less access to nuance, context, and consequence. The emotional intensity narrows your cognitive bandwidth. This is not a moral failing. It's a biological reality. And knowing it is useful, because it tells you something important. Waiting until you're in a state of high emotional arousal to try to regulate yourself is working against the system's design. The work of emotional mastery happens primarily between the moments of high activation, building capacity and skill, in the calm that changes how the system responds when the heat comes. The interoceptive system. One of the most significant developments in our understanding of emotion over the past 2 decades is the growing recognition of the role of interoception, the brain's monitoring of the body's internal state, in generating emotional experience. Your brain is constantly receiving signals from every organ in your body: your heart, lungs, gut, muscles, skin. These signals tell the brain about the body's current physiological state, energy levels, arousal, hunger, temperature, tension, discomfort. The brain doesn't just receive these signals passively. It actively interprets them, making predictions about what they mean in the current context, and those interpretations are a major driver of emotional experience. The gut, in particular, has received significant research attention for its role in emotional processing. The enteric nervous system, the complex network of neurons lining the digestive tract, communicates bidirectionally with the brain via the vagus nerve, a major pathway running from the brainstem through the chest and abdomen. The phrase gut feeling turns out to be more literal than metaphorical. The physical sensations in your gut are part of the data your brain uses to construct emotional experience, and disturbances in gut-brain signaling are associated with mood disorders, anxiety, and emotional regulation difficulties. What this means practically is that your emotional life is not happening only in your head. It is happening in your body, and working with your body, not just your thoughts, is essential to changing your emotional patterns. You cannot think your way to a calmer nervous system. You can, however, breathe your way there. You can move your way there. You can sleep your way there. These are not metaphors. They are physiological interventions in a system that is embodied, not abstract. Polyvagal theory and the three states of safety. In the 1990s, a neuroscientist named Stephen Porges developed what he called polyvagal theory, a framework for understanding how the autonomic nervous system governs our states of safety and connection, and how those states drive emotional and social behavior. While polyvagal theory remains somewhat debated in academic circles, its clinical utility has been substantial, and the basic framework offers a useful map of the territory. Porges proposed that the autonomic nervous system has three primary states, each associated with a distinct behavioral and emotional repertoire. The first state is the ventral vagal state, what Porges calls the safe and social state. When your nervous system detects that you are safe, connected, and in the presence of trustworthy others, this state activates. Your face becomes more expressive, your voice becomes more melodic and prosodic, you can hear voices more easily against background noise, your heart rate is regulated, and you are genuinely capable of engagement, curiosity, creativity, and connection. This is the state in which you are at your best, in relationships, in thinking, in performance. The second state is the sympathetic activation state, fight or flight. When threat is detected, the sympathetic nervous system mobilizes. Heart rate increases, breathing becomes shallower and faster, muscles tense, digestion slows, and attention narrows. You are prepared for action. This state is not inherently pathological, you need it for exercise, for motivation, for responding to genuine urgency. The problem arises when it's chronically activated in the absence of genuine threat, or when the intensity of the response is wildly disproportionate to the actual situation. The third state is the dorsal vagal state, the freeze or shutdown state. When the nervous system detects overwhelming threat that it cannot escape or fight, an older, more primitive response activates: immobility, dissociation, emotional numbness, collapse. This is the state of learned helplessness, of emotional shutdown, of the kind of numbness that can feel like peace but is actually withdrawal from engagement with life. Most people cycle between these states continuously throughout the day, usually without much awareness of the transitions. Understanding which state you're in at any given moment is one of the most useful pieces of self-knowledge you can have, because different states require different interventions. Trying to use a cognitive reappraisal technique when you're in full sympathetic activation is like trying to read a map while running for your life. The body has to come down first. The mind follows. Why insight alone doesn't regulate emotion? There is a frustrating experience that almost everyone who has done any personal development work will recognize: knowing exactly what you're doing wrong in the moment and doing it anyway. You know you're overreacting. You know the situation doesn't warrant this level of distress. You can narrate your own psychological patterns with impressive precision and still find yourself unable to stop them in real time. This is not a failure of insight. It's a feature of the way emotional regulation actually works. Insight is processed by the cortex. Emotional activation is driven substantially by subcortical processes that don't require, and often don't respond to, cortical input. As neuroscientist Joseph Ledoux has described, the neural pathways running from the amygdala up to the cortex are far more numerous and stronger than the pathways running from the cortex down to the amygdala. The emotional system is not particularly well designed to receive instructions from the thinking mind. It is much better at sending instructions up. This is why purely cognitive approaches to emotion regulation have limits, and why the most effective interventions tend to involve the body. Slow, deep breathing directly activates the parasympathetic nervous system and reduces sympathetic arousal. It is a physiological intervention, not a philosophical one. Movement processes stress hormones through the muscles that they primed for action, completing the activation cycle that modern life leaves chronically interrupted. Physical touch, particularly from a trusted person, activates the ventral vagal state. Even posture and facial expression feed back into the emotional system. The body is in a loop with the brain, not simply receiving its outputs. None of this means that understanding is useless. Understanding is the map. It tells you where you are and what tools are appropriate. But the work of emotional regulation is embodied work. It happens at the level of the nervous system, not the level of ideas about the nervous system. The ideas point you toward the practices. The practices do the actual work. The stress hormone problem. One aspect of the emotional brain's operation that most people understand poorly is the role of stress hormones, specifically cortisol, in shaping emotional experience over time. Cortisol is not the emergency hormone, that's adrenaline. Cortisol is the sustained stress hormone. It releases during ongoing demanding situations and remains elevated for hours, preparing the body for a prolonged challenging period by increasing blood sugar, suppressing immune activity, and maintaining a state of metabolic and cognitive readiness. In small doses, cortisol is adaptive. It enhances memory consolidation, improves certain types of focused attention, and helps sustain effort under demanding conditions. In chronic doses, when the conditions that trigger its release are ongoing rather than temporary, it becomes deeply problematic. Chronically elevated cortisol directly impairs the prefrontal cortex's functioning. The thinking, regulating, perspective-taking brain becomes less effective the longer it has been bathed in stress hormones. Simultaneously, the amygdala becomes more reactive. Its threat detection sensitivity increases under chronic stress, meaning that triggers that wouldn't ordinarily register as significant begin activating the threat response. The regulatory system weakens exactly as the activation system strengthens. This is the neurological signature of what most people experience as burnout, not simply tiredness, but a genuine change in how the brain processes emotional and threatening information. The emotionally exhausted person is not less resilient because of a character failure. They are less resilient because their regulatory hardware has been weakened by sustained cortisol exposure at the same time that their threat detection hardware has become hypersensitive. They need different conditions, not more willpower. Understanding this has practical implications for emotional mastery. During periods of high sustained stress, major life transitions, intense work demands, relationship crises, health challenges, your emotional regulation capacity is genuinely reduced. Not imagined, not a weakness, neurologically reduced. The appropriate response is not to expect the same level of regulation you have during calmer periods, but to increase the inputs that downregulate the stress hormone system: sleep, exercise, genuine social connection, and deliberate recovery time. These are not luxuries. They are maintenance on the regulatory hardware. Neuroplasticity. And the good news: the same principle that makes chronic stress damaging, the brain's malleability, its capacity to change structure and function in response to experience, is also the source of genuine hope for everyone who wants to change their emotional patterns. The research on mindfulness meditation's effects on brain structure has been among the most striking findings in this area. Studies by Sarah Lazar at Harvard and others using MRI imaging found that experienced meditators show measurable changes in the thickness of the prefrontal cortex and other regions involved in self-awareness and emotional regulation. A famous study found that 8 weeks of mindfulness-based stress reduction, less than an hour of practice per day, produced measurable reductions in amygdala gray matter density, correlating with reduced stress and improved emotional regulation. The change was structural, visible in the tissue of the brain. Exercise research has produced similarly striking findings. A single bout of aerobic exercise measurably reduces amygdala reactivity for several hours afterward. Regular exercise practice over months produces durable changes in the brain's stress response systems and consistently shows effects on depression and anxiety comparable to medication in randomized controlled trials, with superior long-term maintenance. Sleep research adds another dimension. During REM sleep, the dream stage, the brain processes emotionally significant events from the day, and specifically it does so in a neurochemical environment that strips the stress hormones from the memories. The technical term is emotional memory reprocessing. The emotional charge associated with difficult experiences is reduced during REM sleep, making them easier to access and think about without re-triggering the full physiological response. People who are chronically REM deprived through poor sleep quality, insufficient sleep duration, or alcohol, which suppresses REM, don't get this nightly processing, and the backlog of unprocessed emotional charge accumulates over time. All of this is evidence for the same fundamental fact: the brain changes. The patterns that feel immovably fixed are not fixed. They are patterns, regularities in a dynamic system, and dynamic systems, when given different inputs consistently enough, produce different outputs. The work of emotional mastery is the work of changing the inputs. Practical reflection: spend a few minutes with the concept of the three nervous system states: safe and social, fight or flight, freeze and shut down. Think back over the past week and identify at least one moment when you were clearly in each state. What was happening when you felt most at ease, connected, and open? What triggered the shift into activation or shutdown? What helped or would have helped bring you back? Then, try this simple experiment. The next time you notice yourself in a state of sympathetic activation, chest tight, thoughts racing, jaw or shoulders bracing, try a physiological sigh before doing anything else. Inhale through your nose, then add a second short inhale on top of it to fully inflate the lungs, then exhale slowly and completely through your mouth. Do this 2 or 3 times. Notice what happens to your body. This is not a trick. It is a direct activation of your vagus nerve, a physiological tool, grounded in real neuroscience. Notice the effect. That noticing is the beginning of working with your system rather than simply being inside it. Chapter 3: The Emotional Audit. Every person has a dominant emotional pattern, a characteristic way that difficult feelings show up and get handled. Or not handled. Most people don't know their pattern clearly, because it's the water they swim in. It feels normal. It feels like just how things are, how they are. But emotional dysregulation, the inability to move through difficult emotional states in ways that serve you, doesn't look the same in every person, and treating it as a single phenomenon leads to using the wrong tools. The person who explodes needs something different from the person who shuts down. The person drowning in rumination needs a different intervention than the person who can't identify what they feel at all. This chapter is about identifying your pattern. It offers 4 profiles, not as rigid diagnoses, but as orientating maps. Most people see themselves primarily in one, with elements of another. The profiles are descriptions of behavior and experience, not judgments of character. Every one of them is a learned adaptation, often intelligent in its original context, that has outlived its usefulness. Profile 1: the reactor. If you are a reactor, your emotions arrive fast and loud. The lag between trigger and response is almost non-existent. A criticism lands, and before you've had time to evaluate it, you're already responding, defensively, angrily, or in tearful distress. A conflict begins and escalates before either party quite understands how they got there. A frustration spills into something larger than it warrants. The intensity of the reactor's emotional responses tends to be disproportionate to the actual situation, not always, but frequently enough that there's a recognizable pattern. From the inside, the reactor often experiences their emotions as something that happens to them rather than something they generate. I just snapped, it came out of nowhere, I couldn't stop myself. These are the language patterns of someone who experiences their emotional responses as involuntary and external. And in a neurological sense, there's some truth to this. The reactor's emotional system has a particularly short fuse, a window between trigger and full activation that is narrower than average. This can be genetic in origin, trauma-shaped, or the product of an early environment where emotions were consistently high intensity, a household where big feelings were the norm, where conflict was loud, where emotional regulation was modeled poorly. The aftermath of a reactive episode is typically characterized by regret. The reactor is often not a person without insight, they are a person whose insight arrives too late. After the heat cools, they see clearly what happened, understand the damage done, wish they'd responded differently. This cycle: react, regret, resolve to do better, react again, is deeply demoralizing when it repeats without interruption. What makes it worse is the relational cost. The people around a reactor begin, over time, to manage around them. They avoid certain topics. They walk on eggshells. They stop bringing their full honesty because they're not sure what response it will trigger. The reactor, who is often genuinely warm and generous in calmer states, ends up surrounded by a careful distance they didn't ask for and may not fully understand. The reactor's core challenge is building the gap between stimulus and response, widening the window of tolerance so that intense emotion can be experienced without immediately converting into behavior. This is possible. The brain's threat detection circuitry is malleable. With consistent practice, the window widens, the fuse lengthens, and what once felt like unavoidable eruption becomes, increasingly, a choice. Profile 2. The suppressor looks, from the outside, like a model of emotional composure. They are steady under pressure. They don't get ruffled in difficult conversations. They're often described as calm, stoic, reliable, the person you want in a crisis. And they are, genuinely, good at not showing emotion. The problem is that not showing emotion and not feeling emotion are entirely different things, and for the suppressor, the former is a practiced performance while the latter is not happening at all. Inside the suppressor, there is typically a significant accumulation. Emotions that have nowhere to go don't disappear, they collect. The frustration from Tuesday gets compressed alongside the hurt from last Thursday and the anxiety that hasn't been addressed for 3 years. The suppressor has learned, often very early in life, that expressing emotion is unsafe, unwelcome, or a sign of weakness. They developed the capacity to push difficult feelings down as a genuine survival strategy, and they are good at it. Too good. James Gross, a psychologist at Stanford who has spent decades studying emotion regulation, distinguishes between suppression and reappraisal as two fundamentally different strategies. Suppression, inhibiting emotional expression after the emotion has already been generated, reduces the visible signs of the emotion but does not reduce its physiological impact. In fact, Gross's research shows that suppression tends to increase physiological arousal. The emotion is still happening in the body even as its outward expression is being blocked. The suppressor looks calm but is internally working hard, spending considerable energy on the ongoing project of containment. The pressure cooker dynamic is the suppressor's most characteristic failure mode. The accumulation builds to a point where the lid can no longer be held down, and the release is typically disproportionate, often bizarre to the people around them, who had no idea anything was wrong. This can manifest as sudden and confusing anger, a breakdown that seems to come from nowhere, an abrupt ending to a relationship, or a physical health crisis, because the body does not suppress what the mind is trying to contain. Chronic suppression is associated with elevated rates of cardiovascular stress, immune dysfunction, and a range of physical symptoms that are the body's way of expressing what the mind refuses to. There is also a relational cost that is subtler but equally real. Intimacy requires emotional honesty, and the suppressor, however warm and capable in other dimensions, is not available in the way intimate relationships require. Partners often describe feeling unable to reach them. Friends find the surface pleasant but impenetrable. The suppressor, for their part, often doesn't quite understand why their relationships feel somewhat thin. They are doing everything they know how to do, and they don't understand why it's not enough. The suppressor's work is learning to feel rather than to manage. Not performance of feeling, but actual contact with what's happening internally, before it has built to the point of overflow. Profile 3. The ruminator. The ruminator's emotions don't erupt and they don't get buried. They circulate. A difficult interaction from Monday morning is still being replayed on Friday evening, examined from every angle, turned over looking for the definitive meaning that will finally allow the file to close. The ruminator does not so much experience emotions as live in them, not in the present, life sense, but in the replayed, analyzed, repeatedly returned to sense. The feeling doesn't release. It reconstitutes every time attention falls on it. Rumination is distinct from reflection. Reflection is purposeful. You revisit an experience to extract learning, to understand it better, and then you move forward. Rumination is circular. You revisit the experience and generate more distress without generating more understanding, and the return visits don't diminish in frequency or intensity over time. Research by psychologist Susan Nolan-Hoeksema, who studied rumination extensively, consistently showed that ruminative thinking prolongs and intensifies negative emotional states rather than resolving them. It maintains the physiological arousal associated with the original experience, keeping the stress response partially activated long after the event has passed. The ruminator's inner life is often exhausting, even though nothing visible may be happening. They may appear fine, composed, functional, even engaged, while internally running an elaborate analysis of something that happened weeks ago. They tend to have excellent memories for emotional events, recall the specific words that were said, and be able to reconstruct in full the emotional atmosphere of situations long past. This sensitivity is not a weakness. It is, in appropriate amounts, an asset it makes for people who are thoughtful, empathic, and attuned. But when it tips into rumination, it becomes its own kind of trap. The ruminator is often a person with a strong drive to understand, who believes that if they can just analyze the situation thoroughly enough, they will reach a satisfying conclusion. The frustration is that rumination doesn't produce understanding. It produces repetition. The mind keeps returning not because there's more to extract from the experience, but because the emotional activation associated with it hasn't been discharged. The nervous system is still in some partial state of alert, and the mind is trying to solve its way out of a physiological state that cannot be solved, only regulated. The ruminator's work is learning to discharge emotional activation through the body rather than through the mind, and to develop distress tolerance skills that allow difficult emotions to be felt and released rather than processed endlessly on the cognitive level. Profile for the disconnected person is not suppressing their emotions in the active way the suppressor is. They are genuinely uncertain what they feel, much of the time. Asked how are you feeling, they answer I'm fine, not as a deflection but as an honest report, because below the surface level of basic comfort and discomfort, the emotional terrain is largely unmapped. They may notice that something is off without being able to say what. They may experience emotion primarily as physical sensation, tension, fatigue, headaches, a vague sense of unease, without connecting those sensations to any specific emotional state. They may be surprised when their behavior reveals an emotion they didn't know they were having. The clinical term for severe difficulty identifying and describing emotional states is alexithymia, from the Greek meaning no words for feeling. Alexithymia exists on a spectrum. Full alexithymia is a significant condition associated with a range of psychological and physical health challenges, but subclinical difficulty with emotional awareness is extremely common, particularly in cultures and family environments where emotions were neither modeled nor discussed. The disconnected person's challenge is not a character flaw or a failure of emotional depth. It is, typically, an adaptation. In environments where emotional expression was not safe, not welcomed, or not modeled, where feelings were dismissed, minimized, or treated as irrelevant, developing emotional awareness was not adaptive. The child who learned early that feelings didn't get you anywhere, or that expressing them brought negative consequences, often learned to route around emotional experience as much as possible. The awareness didn't develop fully because it wasn't reinforced. The cost of this is not always visible in the way that reactive or suppressive patterns are. The disconnected person may be highly functional, professionally successful, and socially adequate. What they often notice is a sense of flatness, life lives slightly behind glass, experiences that should feel significant but somehow don't quite reach full feeling, relationships that don't seem to achieve the depth others seem to find natural. They may also notice physical health effects. Unprocessed emotion tends to live in the body, and people with limited emotional awareness often experience elevated levels of psychosomatic symptoms. The disconnected person's work is developing the emotional vocabulary and interoceptive awareness to begin making contact with what's actually happening inside, gently, without forcing, expanding the range of inner experience they can name and relate to. How profiles develop. None of these 4 profiles is innate. None was chosen. Each represents a learned strategy, a way of handling emotional experience that made sense in the environment where it developed, and that has been reinforced by years of practice until it became automatic. The reactor typically developed their pattern in environments of emotional intensity where big feelings were the norm, where conflict was loud, where things were unpredictable enough that a fast, strong response to threat was adaptive. The reactive pattern is, in its origins, a vigilance strategy, always ready, always fast, because slow meant something bad happened. In an environment where that vigilance was warranted, it was the right adaptation. The suppressor typically developed their pattern in environments where emotional expression was unsafe, unwelcome, or ineffective. A family that responded to tears with contempt or dismissal teaches emotional hiding. A culture that treats feelings as weakness and vulnerability as something to be ashamed of teaches suppression as the price of belonging. The suppressive pattern is, at its core, a protective strategy: hide what you feel, and you won't be punished for it. The ruminator typically developed their pattern in environments where things happened that needed to be understood but couldn't be resolved, where a child's natural drive to make sense of difficult experiences was met with more complexity rather than resolution. Rumination is, in its origins, a problem-solving strategy applied to problems that don't yield to analysis. The ruminator keeps turning the experience over because they are still, at some level, searching for the resolution that was never available. The disconnected person typically developed their pattern in environments where emotional experience was treated as irrelevant or non-existent, where feelings were not named, not discussed, not modeled, or actively discouraged as distractions from more important things. Emotional disconnection is, in its origins, an efficiency strategy. If feelings aren't recognized as a relevant category of experience, they don't get developed. The awareness that wasn't reinforced didn't grow. Understanding the origin of your pattern doesn't dissolve it, but it does change your relationship with it. Instead of experiencing the pattern as a character flaw to be overcome through sufficient willpower, you can begin to see it as a strategy that was once sensible, being carried into a present where different strategies are available. That reframe is not just philosophical. It changes what you're doing when you work on the pattern. You're not fighting yourself. You're updating yourself. Identifying your primary profile. Most people recognize themselves most clearly in one of these profiles, with secondary characteristics from another. The reactor might also have some suppressor qualities, alternating between outbursts and periods of shutdown containment. The ruminator might also be somewhat disconnected, uncertain what they feel but unable to stop turning it over. The patterns overlap and combine. What matters is identifying where your greatest dysregulation costs come from, the pattern that creates the most difficulty in your life, the one that shows up most consistently in your hardest moments. That is where the work is most needed, and that is what will guide your approach in Part 3. Practical reflection below is a self-scoring audit. For each set of 3 questions, answer honestly. Give yourself 1 point for each statement that describes you, even partially. Your highest scoring profile is your dominant pattern. Reactor audit: I have said or done something in the heat of emotion that I later regretted. In arguments, I tend to escalate rather than de-escalate. When I feel criticized or dismissed, my response comes out before I've had time to think. Suppressor audit: I rarely show strong emotions in front of other people, even when I'm feeling them intensely. I often wait until I'm alone to process difficult feelings, or don't process them at all. I have occasionally surprised myself or others with an outburst that felt like it came from nowhere. Ruminator audit: when something goes wrong, I find myself replaying it in my mind for days or even weeks. I tend to analyze difficult interactions extensively, looking for what I or others should have done differently. It takes me a long time to emotionally move on from conflicts, disappointments, or embarrassments. Disconnected audit: when people ask how I'm feeling, my honest answer is often fine or I don't know. I sometimes notice that I've been feeling something, stress, sadness, anger, only after others have pointed it out. My feelings tend to show up as physical sensations before I can identify them as emotions. Tally your scores. Then consider, in your most difficult emotional moments, what do you do? This is your pattern. And now that you can see it, you can begin to work with it directly. Chapter 4, The Reactivity Problem. In 1988, a Yale psychologist named Peter Salovey and his colleague John Mayer published a paper introducing the concept of emotional intelligence. The idea gained mainstream traction 6 years later when science journalist Daniel Goleman published his landmark book and popularized a term that would reshape how organizations, educators, and individuals think about success. One of Goleman's most widely cited concepts, the one that gave a name to what millions of people had experienced but couldn't quite describe, was the amygdala hijack. You know what it is, even if you haven't heard the term. It's the moment when an email from your boss triggers a cascade that ends with you saying something you'll spend the next 3 days trying to walk back. It's the point in an argument where the conversation stops being about the original issue and becomes something else entirely, something older and more loaded, and you're aware of it happening but somehow unable to stop it. It's the meeting where a comment that was probably benign lands as an attack, and your response, your voice, your posture, the words that come out of your mouth makes that interpretation visible to everyone in the room. The hijack happens in less than a second. The consequences can last for years. The neuroscience of hijack the amygdala, as discussed in the previous chapter, is the brain's primary threat detection circuit. It is fast, extremely fast. It processes incoming sensory information before the prefrontal cortex has had a chance to evaluate it, which means that by the time you have a conscious thought about a threat, your body has already been prepared to respond to it. Your heart rate has already begun to climb. Your stress hormones are already releasing. Your muscle tension has already increased. Goldman's term hijack captures something real. In states of high emotional activation, the prefrontal cortex's regulatory influence over behavior is substantially reduced. The thinking brain doesn't go offline entirely, you're still generating language, still forming sentences, but its contribution to the decision about what to do with the arousal is significantly diminished. You become, in those moments, more reactive and less responsive. The gap between impulse and action narrows to almost nothing. What makes this particularly consequential is that the amygdala is not especially good at distinguishing between genuine physical threats and social or psychological ones. The circuit evolved to respond to predators, rival humans, and immediate physical dangers. It does not make fine discriminations between you are about to be attacked and your colleague is questioning your competence in front of others. Both register as threat. Both activate the cascade. The intensity of the response might be modulated somewhat by context, but the basic machinery is the same. There's an additional layer worth understanding. The amygdala doesn't only respond to present threats, it responds to anticipated ones. Anticipatory anxiety, the feeling of dread before a difficult conversation or a high-stakes situation, activates the same threat response as the situation itself. This means that for someone with a pattern of high reactivity, the emotional taxation isn't limited to the moments of actual conflict or difficulty. It begins in advance, sometimes far in advance, and the accumulated arousal means they enter challenging situations with the window of tolerance already partially consumed. They're starting the interaction already somewhat activated, which is why the escalation to full hijack can happen so quickly. The fuse was already short before the match arrived. The other piece of neuroscience that's worth holding onto is the role of the insula, a region of the brain deeply involved in interoception, the monitoring of the body's internal state. Research by neurologist Antonio Damasio and others has demonstrated that the body's signals feed forward into emotional experience in a continuous loop. When the body is in a state of high arousal, when the heart is racing, the muscles are tense, the breath is shallow, the insula reads those signals and contributes to the construction of a threat-appropriate emotional state. This means that physical factors, sleep deprivation, hunger, chronic pain, illness, alcohol or caffeine, that elevate baseline physiological arousal also elevate vulnerability to emotional hijack. You are not equally reactive in all conditions. Managing the physical conditions of your body is managing your emotional reactivity. Reactivity is learned, not fixed. Here is the most important thing to understand about emotional reactivity: it is not a fixed personality trait. It is not wired in immutably, and it is not a reflection of your character. It is a learned pattern shaped by early experience, reinforced by repetition, and genuinely changeable through deliberate practice. The concept that matters here is what psychologist Dan Siegel calls the window of tolerance. The window of tolerance is the range of emotional arousal within which you can function effectively. You're engaged, responsive, and still able to access your thinking mind. Below the window, you become hypoaroused, numb, checked out, flat, dissociated. Above the window, you become hyperaroused, overwhelmed, reactive, impulsive, flooded. Emotional reactivity is what happens when you go above the window, when the intensity of the emotional state exceeds the capacity of your regulatory system to contain it. The window is not the same for everyone, and it is not fixed within a single person. Early experiences, particularly those involving attachment and stress in childhood, shape the initial calibration of the window. Children who grow up in environments of unpredictable stress, emotional volatility, or inadequate attunement often develop narrower windows. Their nervous systems are calibrated for a high-threat environment, and even relatively minor stressors can push them above tolerance into reactive states. This is not their fault. It is an adaptation to the environment they grew up in. But, and this is crucial, the window can be widened. This is one of the most well-supported findings in the neuroscience of stress and emotion regulation. The nervous system is plastic. With consistent, appropriately calibrated challenge experiences that approach the edge of the window without exceeding it, the window expands. Practices like mindfulness meditation, certain types of therapy, somatic work, and consistent safe social connection all reliably widen the window over time. What once caused flooding becomes manageable. What once triggered a hijack becomes a strong feeling that you can stay with without acting on. The compound cost, the immediate cost of a reactive episode is visible: the damaging thing said, the relationship harmed, the professional impression damaged. But there is a compound cost that is harder to see and ultimately more significant. People who are around emotionally reactive individuals, as partners, colleagues, friends, or children, adapt. They learn to navigate around the reactivity. They stop bringing certain topics. They stop being fully honest. They become strategic about timing and framing in ways that weren't necessary before the pattern established itself. They perform a kind of ongoing emotional labor, managing not only their own emotional state but anticipating and managing the reactive person's state as well. And gradually, often without anyone making an explicit decision about it, intimacy and genuine communication erode. This adaptation happens even in people who love the reactive person deeply. It's not malicious. It's self-protective. And the reactive person, who often genuinely does not understand why their relationships seem to be keeping them at arm's length, pays the price of a pattern they may not even recognize fully in themselves. There is also the internal compound cost. Each reactive episode tends to generate guilt, shame, and self-criticism in the aftermath, which itself creates emotional arousal that increases the likelihood of the next reactive episode. The pattern feeds itself. Reactivity produces shame, shame produces emotional dysregulation produces more reactivity. Without an external intervention, a practice, a support, a deliberate interruption, the cycle tends to tighten rather than loosen over time. The hidden profile of reactivity. One of the less obvious aspects of emotional reactivity is how it operates in people who don't think of themselves as reactive. The explosive, visibly angry person is easy to identify. But reactivity has quieter forms that are equally costly and considerably harder to see. There is the person who becomes suddenly cold when they feel slighted, not explosive, but shutting down, withdrawing warmth, creating an icy distance that the people around them feel but can't quite name. This is reactivity expressed through avoidance rather than aggression. The emotional activation is just as real: the amygdala has registered threat, the system has mobilized, but the behavioral expression is withdrawal rather than attack. There is the person who turns to self-deprecating humor or deflection whenever they feel criticized or put on the spot, a learned reactive move that discharges the uncomfortable arousal through self-mockery before the more vulnerable feeling can emerge. The laughter feels like lightness, but it's actually a reactive escape from a feeling that hasn't been tolerated. There is the person who becomes excessively accommodating, suddenly agreeable, overly apologetic, in the face of interpersonal tension, whose nervous system has learned that fawning and appeasement reduce threat faster than standing their ground, and who therefore cancels their own needs, opinions, or limits reflexively when conflict appears. This is sometimes called the fawn response, and it is as much a reactive pattern as fight or flight. The difference is that it tends to attract less attention, and often earns social praise rather than criticism, which makes it harder to examine honestly. All of these patterns share the same underlying architecture: an emotional activation that exceeds the window of tolerance, driving a rapid behavioral response that bypasses deliberate choice. The reactive explosion and the reactive collapse both originate in the same failure of the regulatory system to contain the activation long enough for a considered response to emerge. Emotional contagion. One of the most significant findings in social psychology over the past several decades concerns something called emotional contagion, the automatic, largely unconscious transfer of emotional states between people. Research by psychologist Elaine Hatfield and her colleagues showed that people spontaneously mimic the facial expressions, posture, and vocal qualities of those they interact with, and that this mimicry produces corresponding changes in their own emotional experience. You don't just perceive another person's emotion, you briefly feel it yourself, through a process that operates faster than conscious thought. The implications of this for understanding reactivity are profound. Your emotional state is not a private internal experience that others simply observe from a safe distance. It is a signal that your nervous system broadcasts and that others' nervous systems receive. When you enter a room in a state of heightened arousal, visibly stressed, subtly hostile, anxiously activated, the people around you begin to shift toward that state. Their mirror neurons fire. Their autonomic nervous systems register the signals your body is broadcasting. They become, slightly but measurably, more aroused themselves. This is the contagion mechanism that makes a reactive person's impact in a group setting so much larger than their individual behavior would suggest. A single person in a state of emotional activation can shift the emotional climate of an entire room, an entire team, an entire household. And the reverse is equally true. A person whose nervous system is genuinely regulated, not performing calm, but actually regulated, has a stabilizing effect on those around them. They become, in Porges' terms, a co-regulatory resource. Their calm is contagious in the same way that anxiety is. This is why the work of emotional mastery is never purely personal. It is relational. What you do with your emotional life ripples outward in ways that are measurable and real. What recovery looks like. The goal for someone working on reactivity is not to eliminate the amygdala response, that would be both impossible and inadvisable, since the system serves genuine functions. The goal is to change the relationship between the activation and the behavior. To build enough gap, enough regulatory capacity, that the activation can be experienced without immediately converting into action. This happens at several levels simultaneously. At the physiological level, it means building practices that regularly down-regulate the sympathetic nervous system. Exercise, quality sleep, breath practices, and time in genuine social connection all reduce baseline arousal and expand the window of tolerance. A well-rested person with a regular exercise practice has a physiologically wider window than the same person sleep-deprived and sedentary, regardless of anything happening psychologically. At the cognitive level, it means developing the capacity for real-time labeling of emotional states, what neuroscientist Matthew Lieberman at UCLA has studied under the term affect labeling. His research shows that putting words to an emotional experience measurably reduces amygdala activation. The act of naming what you feel engages the prefrontal cortex in a way that creates a slight but real reduction in the emotional intensity. This is the neuroscientific basis for the pause and name practice that appears in every serious emotion regulation protocol, including the Level 1 practice in Part 3. At the relational level, it means building repair capacity, the ability to recognize when a reactive episode has caused harm and to address it directly with the person affected. Research by John Gottman on couples shows that the capacity for repair after conflict is one of the strongest predictors of relationship health. Not the absence of conflict or reactive episodes, but the willingness and skill to repair the connection afterward. Reactive episodes that are followed by genuine repair do less lasting damage than episodes that are ignored or minimized. Recovery also means, crucially, self-compassion rather than shame in the aftermath of reactivity. Shame is physiologically activating, it increases arousal rather than reducing it, which makes the next reactive episode more likely. Self-compassion, acknowledging what happened, understanding the pattern behind it, and treating yourself with the same patience you'd extend to someone you cared about, reduces arousal and creates space for genuine learning. The reactive person who beats themselves up after every episode is not building emotional mastery. They are building the physiological conditions for the next episode. The particular challenge of familiar people. One of the most consistent and humbling findings in the psychology of reactivity is that it is almost always worst in our closest relationships. The people who see us at our most reactive are typically the people we love most: partners, family members, close friends, rather than strangers or professional acquaintances. This is counterintuitive if you believe that reactivity is primarily about threat level. Surely the people who are safest to us should produce the calmest responses. But the pattern makes neurological sense once you understand the attachment system. The people we are closest to are the people who are most capable of activating our attachment fears, the deep concerns about acceptance, about abandonment, about being truly known and still wanted. A criticism from a stranger has no power to touch those fears. A criticism from a partner lands against the entire architecture of the relationship, the entire history of what it means to be accepted or rejected by this particular person. The amygdala doesn't respond to the objective threat level, it responds to the subjective stakes, and the stakes are highest where the attachment is deepest. This is why people who are entirely composed in professional settings, who handle difficult conversations with colleagues with grace and steadiness, can be completely hijacked in intimate relationships over what looks from outside like minor disagreements. It's not hypocrisy. It's the attachment system activating at the intensity that the depth of the relationship warrants, which is often far beyond what the surface content of any particular conflict would seem to require. The implication for practice is specific. The people most worth doing regulation work with, the relationships in which the window-widening practice most needs to be applied, are not the professionally challenging ones. They are the intimate ones. That's where the work is hardest and where it matters most. And the good news is that regulation capacity built in intimate relationships tends to generalize outward. Becoming calmer with your partner makes you calmer with your colleagues, not the reverse. Practical reflection: think of your 3 most recent reactive episodes, moments when your emotional response was faster or more intense than the situation warranted. For each, consider, what was the trigger, what was the body sensation that came just before the words or behavior, and what, in retrospect, was the emotion underneath the reaction? Very often, reactive anger conceals hurt. Reactive defensiveness conceals shame. Reactive withdrawal conceals fear. See if you can get underneath the surface response to what was actually driving it. Then consider your window of tolerance across different conditions. When does your window feel widest? When do you handle difficulty with the most grace? Notice the circumstances, your sleep, your stress level, your sense of connection with the people around you, your physical state. When does your window feel narrowest? When are you most vulnerable to being pushed above tolerance? Notice those conditions too. The window is not fixed. It is dynamically shaped by conditions you can, over time, increasingly influence. That influence starts with awareness of exactly this. Chapter 5, The Suppression Problem. There is a study that has become one of the most replicated findings in the psychology of emotion regulation, and it begins with a simple instruction. Participants are shown an emotionally disturbing film, graphic medical procedures, upsetting accidents, scenes designed to evoke strong negative emotion. Half of them are told to watch the film normally. The other half are given a specific instruction: suppress any emotional expression while watching. Don't let anything show on your face. Don't let anyone who might be watching you know what you're feeling. The suppressors succeed, by the standard measure. Their faces show less emotion. Observers rating their responses would correctly identify them as suppressing. By every visible metric, they are controlling themselves admirably. But when researchers measure what's happening in their bodies during the film, they find something unexpected. The suppressors' heart rates and skin conductance levels, measures of physiological arousal, are not lower than those of the non-suppressing group. They are higher. The emotion is still fully active in their bodies. The suppression effort, the energy directed at containing the expression of what they feel, is itself generating additional physiological stress. They are working hard to appear calm, and the work costs them. This is the central paradox of emotional suppression. It is not an effective strategy for reducing emotional experience. It is a strategy for hiding it from others, and often from yourself, while the emotion continues to run in full beneath the surface. James Gross and the suppression research. Stanford psychologist James Gross has spent his career building what he calls the process model of emotion regulation, a framework that distinguishes between different regulation strategies based on when and how they intervene in the emotional process. His research has consistently identified emotional suppression as one of the least effective and most costly approaches available, while illuminating why it remains so popular. Suppression, in Gross's framework, is a response-focused strategy. It intervenes late in the process, after the emotion has already been generated, by modifying how it's expressed. This is why it doesn't reduce the underlying physiological experience. The emotion is already fully activated by the time the suppression effort begins. What the effort does is add a second layer of physiological load, the exertion of actively inhibiting expression, on top of an emotional state that hasn't diminished. Gross compares suppression to what he calls cognitive reappraisal, a strategy that intervenes much earlier in the emotional process, at the point of meaning-making. Reappraisal involves changing how you interpret or think about a situation, which alters the emotion that gets generated from the start rather than trying to contain one that's already running. His research consistently shows that reappraisal is associated with lower physiological arousal, better psychological well-being, more genuine regulation of emotional experience, and better social outcomes. Suppressors, compared to high reappraisers, tend to show higher rates of depression and anxiety, poorer memory for social interactions, because suppression consumes cognitive resources that would otherwise support encoding, and worse relationship quality. The reason suppression persists despite these costs is that it works in one important dimension: in the short term, for the purpose of not disrupting a social situation, suppression is effective. If you need to get through a meeting without showing how angry you are, suppression will do that for you. The cost arrives later, in the afterburn of physiological arousal, in the emotional backlog, in the gradual accumulation that builds pressure over time. Because the cost is delayed and diffuse, and the benefit is immediate and concrete, the strategy continues to feel like a reasonable trade even when its long-term effects are clearly negative. How suppression accumulates. The pressure cooker dynamic is not a metaphor. It describes something that happens physiologically when emotional activation is repeatedly generated and never discharged. Every time you feel a strong emotion and prevent it from completing its natural expression, whether through active suppression, through distraction, through staying chronically busy, or through substance use, the physiological arousal associated with that emotion doesn't fully clear. It diminishes somewhat, but leaves a residue. Over time, repeated suppression across multiple emotions produces a background level of physiological arousal that is higher than baseline, a kind of chronic partial activation of the stress response system. This accumulated arousal has several effects. It lowers the threshold for future emotional activation. Small triggers produce larger responses than they should, because there's already elevated arousal in the system. It impairs sleep, because the nervous system is never fully reaching the down-regulated state that genuine rest requires. It affects cognitive function. Chronic arousal impairs working memory, narrows attentional focus, and reduces the kind of flexible, creative thinking that solves complex problems. And it creates a vulnerability to the release event, the moment when the lid comes off, not by conscious choice but because the accumulated pressure exceeds the suppression system's capacity. The release event is often what brings the suppressor to the attention of others and to their own attention. It is the apparently inexplicable breakdown in a relationship that has seemed fine for years, the angry outburst at a colleague over something minor, the physical collapse that arrives as illness or exhaustion when there is finally a break in the pressure. The suppressor often cannot explain the intensity of the release, because they haven't been tracking the accumulation that preceded it. From the inside, it feels like it came from nowhere. From a physiological standpoint, it has been building for a long time. What suppression does to memory and relationships. There is another cost of suppression that Gross's research illuminates and that doesn't receive enough attention: what suppression does to social relationships and to the suppressor's ability to form genuine connections. When you suppress emotional expression in an interaction, you're not just hiding what you feel, you're also consuming cognitive resources. The active work of containment takes mental bandwidth. Gross's studies found that people interacting with suppressors remember less of what was discussed. The cognitive burden of monitoring and managing their emotional expression impaired their encoding of the conversation's content. But the effect on the other person is equally striking. Participants in studies who interacted with a suppressor reported feeling less comfortable and less connected than those who interacted with a non-suppressor, even when they had no idea they were dealing with someone actively suppressing. Something in the interaction felt off. Something was being withheld that the other person's social nervous system detected, even without conscious awareness. This is a profound relational cost. Intimacy, genuine connection, the kind of trust that allows two people to build a real relationship, all of these require the experience of being seen. Not performance, but genuine transmission. When what you're transmitting in an interaction has been carefully censored, the other person receives a signal that something is hidden, and however unconsciously, they respond by maintaining their own distance, by trusting you a little less, by the interaction feeling subtly incomplete. The suppressor, who often deeply wants connection, creates the conditions that prevent it with the very mechanism they use to try to make themselves acceptable. The body keeps the score. One of the most important contributions to the understanding of emotional suppression and physical health came from psychiatrist Bessel van der Kolk, whose work on trauma and embodied emotion demonstrated with remarkable clarity that the body does not simply receive and then clear emotional experience the way the mind might like to believe. Unprocessed emotional activation persists in somatic form, in patterns of chronic muscle tension, in altered autonomic nervous system function, in changed breathing patterns and posture, in the physiology of the gut and the immune system. This is why the clinical picture of chronic suppression often includes physical symptoms that seem unrelated to emotion: persistent back or neck pain, digestive problems, frequent illness, fatigue that doesn't resolve with rest, headaches, and an array of what medicine sometimes calls medically unexplained symptoms. The body is expressing what the mind is refusing to process. This isn't psychological in the dismissive sense, it isn't all in your head. The physiology is real. The mechanisms are now well enough understood that the connection between emotional suppression and physical health outcomes is no longer seriously disputed in the research literature. The concept of alexithymia is relevant here. Individuals with alexithymia, literally, no words for feeling, struggle to identify and describe their emotional states and tend to experience emotion primarily as physical sensation rather than differentiated feeling. Research has consistently found elevated rates of psychosomatic illness, autoimmune conditions, and cardiovascular problems in this population. The body is carrying what the emotional system cannot process. The more you can move emotional experience from the body into consciousness, naming it, feeling it, allowing it to complete, the less of that burden the body carries alone. The difference between suppression and appropriate discretion, an important distinction, is worth making explicit. The alternative to suppression is not the absence of all filtering. Emotional mastery does not mean expressing everything you feel in real time to whoever is present. That would not be mastery, it would be emotional incontinence, and it would create significant practical problems in social and professional life. There is a meaningful difference between suppression, pushing an emotion down and refusing to process it, and appropriate discretion, noting what you feel, allowing yourself to genuinely experience it internally, and making a deliberate choice about when, how, and with whom to express it externally. The suppressor does the first. The emotionally intelligent person does the second. The key is what happens after the discretion. If you choose not to express a difficult emotion in a given moment because the context doesn't support it, the question is, what do you do with it afterward? Do you return to it, feel it, process it, perhaps in a journal, perhaps with a trusted person, perhaps through physical movement? Or does the discretion become the default, the emotion gets filed away without processing, and the file never gets opened? The first is self-management. The second is suppression, with a respectability premium. The reset addresses this, processing versus burying. What distinguishes the protocols in Part 3 from generic advice to express your emotions is that they are designed to support the processing of emotion rather than either its suppression or its unfiltered expression. Processing is a specific thing. It means bringing the emotion into awareness, naming it accurately, feeling it in the body, staying with it long enough for the physiological arousal to begin to discharge, understanding what it's communicating, and then, and only then, deciding what, if anything, to do about it. This process is rarely longer than a few minutes. The physiological cycle of an emotion, when it's not suppressed or fed by additional thoughts, tends to be relatively brief. Research on the duration of emotional episodes suggests that the pure physiological component of most emotions peaks and begins to subside within 90 seconds to a few minutes. What extends emotional duration is typically not the emotion itself but the thinking about the emotion, the narrative, the rumination, the interpretation layered on top of the physiological signal. The suppressor's task is learning to give emotions enough space to be felt without making them permanent, to let the wave wash through rather than building a seawall against it. This sounds simple and feels, to someone who has spent decades building the wall, nearly impossible at first. But the capacity develops. The wall turns out to be costing more than the wave ever would have. Men, socialization, and suppression. It's worth naming something explicitly. Emotional suppression is not equally distributed across the population. Research consistently shows that men, on average, suppress emotional expression at significantly higher rates than women, not because they feel emotions less intensely, but because they have been more thoroughly socialized to do so. The cultural messages around what it means to be a competent, trustworthy, strong man in most Western societies have historically included a powerful prohibition against emotional expression, particularly expressions of fear, sadness, need, and vulnerability. Anger has typically been the exception. The emotion men are permitted, even in some contexts expected, to display. The costs of this for men are substantial and underreported. Male pattern suppression is associated with higher rates of cardiovascular disease, higher rates of suicide. Men die by suicide at nearly 4 times the rate of women in most Western countries, higher rates of substance use disorder, and significantly shorter lifespans. The emotional burden is real, physiologically real, and it is being carried in silence by a very large number of people who have been taught that carrying it in silence is the definition of strength. This is not an accusation. It is a description of a cultural inheritance that causes enormous suffering. And the path out of it is not to shame men for having developed the patterns their environment rewarded, it is to offer an alternative framework in which emotional intelligence is understood as a form of strength rather than a departure from it. A person who can accurately identify what they feel, communicate it clearly, and remain functionally present in difficult situations without either exploding or shutting down is not weak. They are, in the most literal and practical sense, more capable than someone who cannot do those things. Whoever you are, whatever your gender, whatever your cultural background, if you have been taught to suppress, this chapter is for you. The suppression made sense in its original context. That context may have changed. And the cost, as should now be clear, is significant enough to be worth examining honestly. Practical reflection: think of an emotion you suppress habitually, one that you have strong feelings about not showing, or one that seems to disappear before you've fully identified it. It might be sadness, which many people learn to translate into productivity. It might be fear, which often masquerades as anger. It might be grief, which gets converted into busyness. It might be need, which gets reframed as self-sufficiency. For 1 week, try this simple practice. Once per day, find 10 minutes where you are genuinely alone and not doing anything. Sit quietly. Ask yourself what you're actually feeling and then wait. Don't supply the comfortable answer. Wait for the real one. Notice what comes up in your body when you create this kind of internal space. Where do you feel tension? Heaviness? A pulling sensation? What emotion, if you had to name it, lives underneath that sensation? You don't have to do anything with what you find. You don't have to tell anyone. You don't have to resolve it or fix it. Just let yourself know it's there. That's the beginning. That's where suppression stops being automatic and starts being a choice, and choices, unlike automaticity, can be made differently. Chapter 6: Emotions and Your Relationships. In the mid-1980s, a psychologist named John Gottman set up what would become one of the most unusual laboratories in the history of behavioral science. He called it the Love Lab. Couples came in and had ordinary conversations, sometimes pleasant, sometimes about areas of conflict, while sensors measured their heart rates, breathing patterns, and skin conductance, and cameras recorded their facial expressions, posture, and vocal qualities. Gottman and his colleagues watched hours and hours of these interactions and began noticing patterns. Over the following years, they would find patterns so reliable that Gottman claimed accurately, as it turned out, to be able to predict with roughly 90% accuracy which couples would be divorced within several years, based on watching just a few minutes of interaction. What the patterns revealed was not complicated. Successful long-term relationships were not marked by the absence of conflict. They were not marked by perfect communication or extraordinary compatibility. They were marked by a specific set of emotional behaviors, ways of managing difficult emotional states in the presence of the person you loved, that preserved connection even under stress. And the relationships that were heading toward dissolution showed consistent emotional failures that, once you knew what to look for, were unmistakable. The emotional patterns you carry into your intimate relationships and social world are not a separate topic from emotional mastery. They are the central application of everything in this book. The place where emotional dysregulation does the most damage in most people's lives is not their inner world, it is in the relationships that matter most to them. The 4 horsemen. Gottman identified 4 specific communication patterns that, when they appear consistently in a couple's interactions, are highly predictive of relationship failure. He called them the 4 horsemen. What is striking, in the context of this book, is that all 4 of them are not communication failures in the first instance. They are emotional regulation failures that express themselves through communication. Criticism is the first horseman, and Gottman distinguishes carefully between a complaint, which addresses a specific behavior, and criticism, which attacks the other person's character. "I'm frustrated that you forgot our dinner reservation" is a complaint. "You always do this, you're so thoughtless, you never make me a priority" is criticism. The shift from complaint to criticism is an emotional shift, frustration and hurt, unregulated, becoming contempt or blame, reaching for a broader attack because the immediate grievance isn't satisfying to express. Contempt is the second and most toxic horseman. Gottman calls it the single strongest predictor of divorce. Contempt is disgust expressed toward the partner, eye-rolling, mockery, sarcasm that belittles rather than justs, a fundamental communicative signal that you view the other person as beneath you or not worth taking seriously. Contempt doesn't arise from a single bad interaction. It accumulates from unprocessed resentment, from complaints and hurts that were never voiced, suppressed over time until they coalesced into a negative global view of the partner. The emotion underneath contempt is, almost always, enormous accumulated hurt. Defensiveness is the third horseman, a failure to hear the other person's concern because the emotional system interprets it as attack and mobilizes accordingly. When someone raises an issue and the partner's immediate response is a counter-complaint, a justification, or a denial of responsibility, the nervous system has taken over the conversation. The partner isn't really hearing what's being said, they're protecting themselves from what their body has interpreted as a threat. Nothing productive can happen in that state. Connection cannot deepen when one or both people are defending against it. Stonewalling, emotional shutdown, and withdrawal from interaction is the fourth horseman, and it is typically a physiological phenomenon before it is a behavioral choice. Gottman's research found that the heart rates of people who stonewall during conflict are extremely elevated. They are not choosing to withdraw from a place of calm. They are shutting down because their nervous system is too flooded to remain present. The shutdown is protective, and it is understandable, and it is devastating to connection nonetheless. The person being stonewalled experiences it as abandonment. The stonewaller is overwhelmed. Both are alone. Every one of these patterns is an emotion regulation failure. Criticism is unprocessed hurt reaching for a larger target. Contempt is suppressed resentment finding its outlet in superiority. Defensiveness is the amygdala hijack in conversation. Stonewalling is the dorsal vagal shutdown in the presence of another person. The path back from all of them is not primarily a communication technique, it is emotional work. Emotional unavailability and intimacy. Intimacy requires presence. Not just physical presence, emotional presence, the willingness to be genuinely there with another person, to let what affects them affect you, to be known and to allow knowing. This sounds simple. In practice, for many people, it is one of the most difficult things there is. Emotional unavailability, the inability or unwillingness to be emotionally present in intimate relationships, takes different forms depending on a person's dominant pattern. The suppressor may be physically attentive, kind, and consistent, but unreachable in the specific way that their partner is seeking, through the defenses, behind the controlled surface, to something authentic. The reactor may be intensely present during connection and just as intensely present during conflict, which makes their partner perpetually uncertain about which version will be there. The ruminator may be so preoccupied with processing past interactions that they're not really present to the current moment. The disconnected may not quite understand what their partner means by "I want more from you" emotionally, because the emotional dimension they're being asked to access is precisely the dimension that hasn't been fully developed. In all cases, the result for the partner is something like loneliness within the relationship, the particular loneliness of being with someone who is there but somehow not quite present. Research on relationship satisfaction consistently shows that emotional responsiveness, the partner's sense that you've heard them, understood them, and are genuinely affected by what matters to them, is a central driver of relationship quality. Not problem-solving ability. Not shared interests. Emotional responsiveness. Developing emotional availability is not a matter of performing more empathy or learning the right things to say. It requires actually doing the internal work, developing the awareness, the vocabulary, and the regulated capacity to be genuinely present with another person's emotional experience without needing to fix it, explain it, minimize it, or escape from it. That capacity is built through exactly the kind of practices outlined in Part 3. It is not incidental to the relational work. It is the relational work. Co-regulation. We are each other's nervous systems. One of the most consequential insights to emerge from the neuroscience of attachment and polyvagal theory is something that should probably be much more widely known. Human beings are not self-contained emotional regulation units. We are built to regulate each other. Our nervous systems are designed to detect and respond to social signals, the tone of a voice, the quality of eye contact, the tension or ease in a body, and to modulate our own arousal states accordingly. This is what Porges means by co-regulation. In early childhood, this is visible and unambiguous. An infant has no capacity to regulate their own emotional states. They are entirely dependent on a caregiver to co-regulate, to soothe distress, to match and modulate arousal, to provide the physiological calming that the infant's own nervous system cannot generate. What the research on attachment documents is that through thousands of repetitions of this co-regulation experience, the child's nervous system gradually develops the capacity to do some of this regulation internally. The adult capacity for self-regulation is built from accumulated co-regulation experience. In a very real sense, other people taught your nervous system how to manage itself. This doesn't end at childhood. Adult co-regulation is a real phenomenon. The presence of a calm, connected, emotionally regulated person has a measurable calming effect on those around them, not because of what they say, but because of what their nervous system broadcasts. Heart rates synchronize in long-term couples. Cortisol levels in chronically stressed people decrease measurably in the presence of a trusted friend. Skin conductance decreases when someone in distress is touched gently by a safe person. The social nervous system is always running, always receiving and transmitting, always participating in the regulation of the people nearby. This means two things that are practically significant. First, your emotional state is a constant offer to the people around you, an offer of regulation or dysregulation, of safety or threat. When you walk into a room in a state of anxious activation, you are making a physiological broadcast that affects everyone there. When you are genuinely regulated, you create a climate of safety that other people's nervous systems can orient toward. Second, you need not regulate alone. The attempt to process all difficult emotion in isolation without the support of trusted relationships, without genuine social connection, is working against your own neurological design. Connection is not a luxury supplement to emotional regulation. It is one of the primary mechanisms of it. Attachment and emotional patterns, the patterns you bring to close relationships, were largely shaped before you had language for them. Attachment research, pioneered by John Bowlby and later mapped into measurable styles by Mary Ainsworth, demonstrates that the quality of the emotional environment in early caregiving shapes the child's internal working model of relationships, their implicit beliefs about whether connection is safe, whether their emotional needs will be met, whether dependence is dangerous, whether people can be trusted to remain present under stress. These working models are not fixed, they can and do change across a lifetime, particularly in the context of significant relationships, therapy, and deliberate self-work. But they are also remarkably durable, because they were formed in the part of development where implicit learning is the dominant mode. You didn't decide on your attachment style. You absorbed it. And the emotional patterns it produces in relationships, the specific ways you approach and avoid closeness, the triggers that activate your defensive responses, the behaviors that emerge under relational stress, feel, from the inside, like just how you are. Someone with an anxious attachment style tends to experience high emotional reactivity in close relationships, amplified distress when separation or rejection is sensed, difficulty self-soothing in the absence of reassurance from the partner, a tendency to pursue connection in ways that can paradoxically push the partner away. Someone with an avoidant style tends to down-regulate emotional needs and emotional expression in close relationships, to pull away when intimacy intensifies, to experience genuine emotional connection as somewhat threatening, to prefer self-sufficiency over the vulnerability of need. Both styles are adaptations to early emotional environments. Both create characteristic patterns of emotional dysregulation in adult intimacy. And both are workable not by ignoring the style, but by understanding it clearly enough to participate more deliberately in the relational patterns it generates. The specific challenge of conflict is where emotional mastery matters most and is hardest to maintain, which is precisely why it deserves specific attention. Most relationship conflicts don't originate in genuine disagreements of value or interest. They originate in emotional dysregulation, one or both people feeling unheard, dismissed, threatened, or unseen, and responding from that physiological state rather than from a place of genuine engagement. The sequence typically goes like this. A need or concern is raised, imperfectly. The partner hears it as criticism, or as a demand, or as a challenge to their adequacy. The threat detection system activates. The partner responds defensively, from the defended place, not from the place that can hear what's actually being communicated. The original speaker experiences the defense as a failure of being heard, which intensifies their emotional activation. The activation intensifies the communication, which intensifies the other person's defensive response. Escalation. What's happening in this sequence is not primarily a communication problem. It's a regulation problem. Two nervous systems are triggering each other into increasingly dysregulated states, and the content of the conversation, the actual concern that was originally raised, is buried under layers of reactive defense. The way through is not better communication techniques applied on top of dysregulated nervous systems. It's regulation first, communication second. Gottman's research identified what he calls the physiological flooding threshold, the heart rate above which effective communication becomes physiologically impossible. His recommendation for couples who reach the threshold during conflict is to take a genuine break, not a strategic exit, but a real physiological cooldown of at least 20 minutes, during which neither person rehearses arguments or continues the conflict mentally. The nervous system needs enough time to actually return to baseline. Then, from a regulated place, the conversation can resume with a different quality of presence. This requires two things that are genuinely difficult: the self-awareness to recognize you're flooded before you've done irreparable damage, and the trust in the process and in the relationship to believe that stepping away is not abandonment but care. Both of those capacities are built through practice. They are not natural. They are learned. What emotional mastery looks like in practice in a relationship: emotional mastery doesn't look like serenity. It doesn't look like never getting upset, never being hurt, never feeling the pull of defensiveness when criticism lands. It looks like something more interesting and more achievable: the ability to be genuinely moved by what's happening without being swept entirely away by it, and the ability to stay in contact with the other person even when the emotional weather is difficult. It looks like pausing when you notice your defensive wall going up, and naming that pause: I'm feeling defensive right now, which means something just felt threatening to me, and I want to understand what, instead of just defending. It looks like staying present in a conversation you'd rather escape, because you recognize that what you're feeling is your nervous system's response to perceived threat, not actual evidence that the conversation is unsafe. It looks like repair, not performance of repair, but genuine acknowledgement, after a reactive episode, of the impact your emotional state had on someone you love, and the offering of something real. It looks like being present for your partner's emotion without immediately trying to fix it, because the presence itself is what they need, and the fixing is partly about your own discomfort with their distress. It looks like knowing when your own emotional state has become too activated for productive conversation and being able to say so clearly, and coming back when the activation has passed. It looks like understanding your attachment patterns well enough to recognize them in real time, to see when the avoidant pull is happening, or when the anxious amplification is running, and to make a different choice than the automatic one. This is not a standard any human being maintains perfectly or consistently. It's a direction of practice. The measure is not zero reactive moments or zero conflict, it's the quality and speed of recovery, and the genuine trajectory toward more of these behaviors over time. The courage of emotional honesty: there's a quality that underlies almost everything that makes intimate relationships genuinely intimate: the willingness to be emotionally honest when it would be easier to be emotionally strategic. To say I'm scared instead of everything is fine. To say I felt hurt when that happened instead of withdrawing for 3 days. To say I need something from you right now instead of building a private resentment about not receiving what was never asked for. Emotional honesty is not the same as emotional expression. Expression is output, it's what comes out when the emotion builds to a point where containment fails. Honesty is deliberate, it's the choice to communicate what's actually happening internally, before the pressure of unexpressed feeling becomes the communication by default. The distinction matters because honesty requires courage in a way that expression often doesn't. Expression happens to you. Honesty is a choice you make, with full awareness of the vulnerability it involves. The fear underneath this is usually the same regardless of which emotional profile you carry: the fear that if the other person sees what's actually there, the fear, the hurt, the uncertainty, the need, they will use it against you, or be overwhelmed by it, or leave, or lose respect for you. This fear is the emotional residue of every time in the past when vulnerability was met with something other than care. It is reasonable fear, based on real experience. And the only way to update it is the same way all fears get updated in the brain: through accumulated new experiences that contradict the old prediction. Genuine emotional honesty with a genuinely safe person is how that update happens. It doesn't require a perfect relationship or a perfectly safe person, it requires a relationship that is safe enough, and the willingness to test that safety incrementally rather than all at once. You say one true thing. You notice how it's received. You say another. The update accumulates. And what once felt like an extraordinary risk, being actually known by another person, gradually begins to feel like the ordinary texture of intimacy. This is the deepest work of emotional mastery in relationships. Not the techniques. Not the regulation strategies. The courage to be genuinely present, genuinely honest, and genuinely there for yourself and for the person in front of you. Practical reflection: consider your most important close relationship, romantic partner, close friend, family member, and think about your emotional patterns within it. Where do you recognize the four horsemen showing up, even occasionally? Not to judge yourself, but to see the pattern. Which horseman do you bring most often? What emotional state is usually underneath it? What feeling are you protecting when you criticize rather than complain, when you withdraw rather than stay present, when you defend rather than hear? Then think about co-regulation. Who in your life makes your nervous system feel safe, whose presence reliably reduces your arousal, makes you breathe easier, makes the world feel more manageable? What is it about those people, specifically? And conversely, whose presence reliably elevates your arousal? What signals are you receiving from them, however subtly? This mapping of your relational nervous system is not abstract. It is practical information about the emotional climate you're living in and what you might want to tend to. Chapter 7, Level 1, the 7-Day Emotional Awareness Practice. Most people who decide they want to work on their emotional life make the same mistake. They try to regulate emotions they can't yet see. They aim to stay calm in situations where they don't yet have a clear picture of what's activating them, or why, or how it feels in the body before it erupts. The result is that the regulation techniques feel forced and mechanical, the effort is inconsistent, and the old patterns reassert themselves because the foundation, basic emotional awareness, was never built. This 7-day protocol is designed to build that foundation. It doesn't ask you to change anything yet. It doesn't require you to regulate your responses or transform your patterns. It asks only for one thing: practice consistently across 1 week, to begin seeing what's actually happening in your emotional life with more accuracy and more precision than you currently have. The research basis for this approach comes from the work of Lisa Feldman, Barrett, and others on emotional granularity, the finding that more differentiated emotional perception correlates with better regulation outcomes, lower rates of depression and anxiety, and more effective responses to stress. You cannot work skillfully with something you cannot accurately perceive. 7 days of this practice won't give you perfect emotional perception, but it will give you a meaningfully more accurate map than the one you started with. Who this level is for? This level is for anyone who is starting from relative scratch with emotional intelligence work, who has little or no existing practice with emotional awareness, or who has spent significant time on emotional disconnection and is beginning the process of re-establishing contact with their inner life. It is also appropriate for anyone who has tried more advanced emotional work and found it overwhelming, who needs to slow down and build a simpler foundation first. If you already have a consistent meditation practice, if you journal regularly about your emotional life, or if you've done significant therapeutic work on emotional awareness, you may want to begin at level 2, though there is no harm in doing this week as a calibration and reset, and many experienced practitioners find that the simplicity of this protocol reveals things they'd been moving past too quickly. 5 core daily rules. The entire protocol rests on 5 daily rules. They are not complicated, but they require consistency. The gap between knowing the rules and actually doing them every day is where most people fall short. Commit to all 5 for 7 days. The practices take a combined 15 to 20 minutes per day. Rule 1: name the emotion 3 times per day. 3 times across the day, ideally morning, midday, and evening. Pause for 60 seconds and name the emotion you're feeling with specificity. Not "I'm stressed" or "I'm fine." Frustrated, anxious, content, irritable, hopeful, flat, melancholy, energized, resistant, tender, scattered. Use the most precise word you have access to. If you don't have a precise word, reach for the closest approximation and note the gap. The naming itself is the practice. Rule 2: rate intensity before acting. When an emotion arrives noticeably, when you feel the shift, rate its intensity on a scale of 1 to 10 before doing anything with it. This single step introduces a pause between stimulus and response. Even if the pause is 15 seconds, it begins to build the gap that emotional regulation depends on. A 3 and an 8 require different responses. Knowing which you're dealing with before you respond is basic emotional literacy. Rule 3: Notice the body location. Emotions live in the body before they arrive in the mind. Each time you notice an emotion, in your 3 daily check-ins or when one arrives during the day, notice where you feel it physically. Is the tension in your chest, your jaw, your stomach, your shoulders, your throat? Is it a heaviness, a tightness, a heat, a vibration, a constriction? The location and quality of the physical sensation is part of the emotion's signature, and learning to read it directly gives you earlier access to what you're feeling before the emotion has built to the point of driving behavior. Rule 4: Log one emotional moment per day. At the end of each day, write down one emotional moment that happened. What triggered it, what you felt, what you did. Keep it short, 3 to 5 sentences. This is not a gratitude journal or a therapeutic narrative. It is a data log. You are building a record that will reveal patterns by the end of the week that you cannot see in any single day. Rule 5: The breath before reacting. Before reacting to anything emotionally, before sending the message, making the call, responding to the comment, take one slow deliberate breath. 1. A slow inhale through the nose, a slow exhale through the mouth. This is not a regulation technique. It is a registration technique. The breath signals to yourself that something is happening, that you're about to respond, and that you're choosing to know that before proceeding. Day-by-day guide. Day focused expected feeling. Key Rule 1: Naming practice. Emotion vocabulary building. Surprisingly hard to name emotions precisely. Most people discover their vocabulary is limited to 5 or 6 words. Rule 1-2: Intensity rating. Calibrating your internal scale. Useful and slightly disorienting. You may find the ratings higher or lower than expected. Rule 2-3: Body awareness. Connecting emotion to physical sensation is strange, then useful. Many people discover they've been feeling an emotion in their body for hours before registering it mentally. Rule 3: For a first full daily log, combining all 3 patterns starting to emerge, the log creates a mild observer perspective that slightly increases the distance between feeling and reacting. Rule 4-5: The breath practice. Pause before responding, slowing down before reacting. You'll likely catch yourself forgetting to pause and then catch yourself catching that. A Rule 5-6: Integration. All 5 rules running simultaneously, small but real. You'll notice you're catching emotions slightly earlier than at the start of the week. All 7: Completion. Final full day. Reflection on what you've noticed. More emotionally literate than you were on day 1. Probably somewhat surprised by what a week of attention reveals. All a slip protocol. You will slip. You will have a reactive moment without pausing, a check-in you forget, a day where the log doesn't happen. This is not a failure. It is information. When you slip, do this, log it. Write, I felt, I did, next time I would. That sentence is the learning. The slip itself isn't the setback would be using the slip as evidence that this doesn't work for you, and stopping. Slips are data points in a pattern you're building awareness of. They are part of the practice, not an interruption of it. Don't add extra rules to compensate for a slip. Don't restart the 7 days. Just continue from where you are, with what you've learned from the slip as part of your data. Daily tracking table. Use this table to record your practice each day. Keep it simple, a few words per cell is enough. The value is in the consistent recording, not in the literary quality of what you write. Date. Emotion named, 3x, intensity, 1 to 10, body location, triggered by my response, day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, day 5, day 6, day 7. At the end of the week, read the table from top to bottom and look for patterns. What emotions appear most frequently? What triggers them? What body locations are recurring? What response patterns repeat? The pattern across 7 days reveals something that any single day cannot. The science behind this practice. It's worth pausing to explain why these 5 rules work, not as an appeal to authority but because understanding the mechanism helps you trust the practice enough to do it consistently, particularly on the days when it feels pointless. Rule 1: Naming emotions works through what neuroscientist Matthew Lieberman at UCLA calls effect labeling. His fMRI research demonstrated that the act of putting words to emotional experience measurably reduces amygdala activation. The naming engages the prefrontal cortex in a way that creates a small but real dampening of the emotional intensity, a neurological version of the old advice to count to 10. The counting doesn't matter, the engagement of the verbal conceptual system does. More precise naming produces more effect, which is why specificity matters more than it might seem. Rule 2: Rating intensity works by introducing what psychologists call metacognitive awareness, awareness of your own mental state rather than just experience of it. The moment you observe your emotional state and rate it, you have stepped slightly outside of it. You are the rater, not only the feeler. This slight observer distance is the precursor to choice. You cannot choose your response to something you can't observe. The rating makes the state observable. Rule 3: Body awareness works by training interoceptive perception, the ability to accurately read your body's internal signals. Research by Lisa Feldman, Barrett and others consistently shows that better interoceptive awareness is associated with higher emotional granularity, more precise emotional perception, and with better regulation outcomes. The body carries emotional information before the mind does, and learning to read that information early gives you more time and more access before the emotion has built into something that's driving behavior. Rules 4 and 5: The log and the breath work by creating structure and pause around the moments that most need them. The log creates a mild accountability and a record that reveals patterns over time. The breath creates the minimal pause, 15 seconds is enough, that separates stimulus from response in the moments when that gap is most threatened. Building your emotional vocabulary: one of the most common discoveries of day one is that emotional vocabulary is narrower than most people expect. If you find yourself reaching for the same handful of words, stressed, fine, bad, upset, okay, here are some more precise alternatives to expand your range. For difficult states: frustrated, irritated, resentful, angry, furious, disappointed, hurt, rejected, humiliated, ashamed, embarrassed, guilty, sad, grieving, melancholy, flat, numb, hollow, anxious, worried, dreading, fearful, overwhelmed, scattered, confused, uncertain, lost, lonely, disconnected, bored, empty. For positive and mixed states: content, at ease, calm, satisfied, hopeful, curious, energized, excited, moved, tender, grateful, proud, connected, warm, playful, expansive, peaceful, open. You don't need to use these words. The point is to push past the vague and toward the specific. The more specific the word, the more accurate the perception, and the more the brain has to work with when it constructs the next response. What to expect: days 1 through 3 will feel mechanical. Checking in with your emotions and naming them when there's nothing dramatic happening can feel artificial, like narrating something that doesn't need narrating. This is normal. The practice hasn't become natural yet. Keep going. By day 4 or 5, something shifts. The check-in starts to feel less like an imposition and more like a genuine question you're interested in answering. You'll notice you're catching emotions slightly earlier in their development, before they become strong enough to drive behavior, rather than after. This earlier access is the whole point. It's the prerequisite for everything that comes next. The goal of this week is awareness, not regulation. You are not trying to change how you feel or how you respond. You are trying to see more clearly what's actually happening. That clarity is the foundation. Without it, everything else is guesswork. With it, the work of building genuine emotional intelligence has somewhere real to begin. By day 7, most people report two things: surprise at how much they didn't know was happening in their emotional life, and a mild but genuine sense of increased agency, the beginning of the feeling that they're in a conversation with their emotions rather than simply being subject to them. That feeling is not an achievement. It's the starting line. Chapter 8, Level 2, the 21-day regulation system. Awareness is the beginning, not the destination. If you've completed the 7-day Level 1 practice, or if you've arrived at this chapter with existing emotional awareness but have not yet built a consistent regulation practice, you're ready for the next layer. This is where the work moves from perception to intervention. From seeing what's happening to actually doing something different with it. The 21-day structure matters. Neuroscience research on habit formation consistently shows that new behaviors need to be practiced across a significant span of time under varied conditions before they become reliably automatic, before the new pattern is encoded deeply enough to be available under stress, not just in calm. 21 days isn't a magic number, but it's enough time to move through at least 3 distinct emotional seasons: the good days, the hard days, and the routine days, and begin to find your regulation capacity in all of them. This protocol draws on the most well-supported techniques in the emotion regulation research literature. Nothing here is invented or speculative. Every technique has a mechanism, a way it changes the physiology or the cognition of emotional experience, and that mechanism has been studied. You're not being asked to try things that might work. You're being given tools that reliably do. Who this level is for people who have basic emotional awareness, who can generally name what they feel with reasonable accuracy, who can notice when they're being activated before the activation fully takes over, and who are ready to build active regulation capacity on top of that foundation. If you've completed level 1, you're likely ready for this. If you're new to the material but have a history of reflective emotional work, journaling, therapy, contemplative practice, you may also be able to start here. The honest criterion is this: when a strong emotion arrives, do you have at least a few seconds of awareness before it drives your behavior? If yes, you have what you need to begin level 2. 6 core daily rules. Rule 1: Morning emotional baseline check-in. Before any screen time, before email, before the day's demands arrive, spend 3 to 5 minutes sitting quietly and asking yourself 2 questions. What is my emotional baseline right now? What is the color and texture of what I'm feeling this morning? And what might be shaping it? What happened yesterday that's still active? What's coming today that's already generating anticipation or dread? What's the physical state of my body? Did I sleep? Am I rested? Am I carrying anything in my muscles or gut? The morning check-in is not about solving anything. It's about arriving in the day with an accurate map of your current internal territory. Rule 2: Choose one regulation technique and use it every time an emotion spikes. From the technique menu below, select one technique for the first week. Use it every single time you notice your emotional intensity climbing above a 5. Not sometimes. Every time. The consistency matters more than the choice of technique. You are building a neural pathway, a learned response to emotional activation, and that pathway requires repetition to establish. Rule 3: Daily reappraisal practice. Each day, identify one difficult emotion, something that arrived during the day and was unpleasant, and spend 5 minutes genuinely finding an alternative interpretation of the situation that triggered it. Not a forced positive spin. A genuinely plausible alternative reading. If your manager gave terse feedback and you felt stung, the default construction might be, "They don't respect my work." A genuine alternative might be, "They were rushed and under pressure, this wasn't about me," or, "The feedback is blunt but it's actually useful, my defensiveness is getting in the way of hearing it," or, "This triggered my old stuff about authority figures, the reaction is bigger than this situation warrants." Reappraisal is the highest leverage cognitive regulation technique in the literature. 3 weeks of daily practice measurably changes how automatically it becomes available under pressure. Rule 4: Evening reflection. At the end of the day, write 3 sentences: what emotion dominated today, how you responded to it, and what you want to do differently. The reflection is not about self-criticism. It's about closing the day's emotional loop deliberately rather than carrying unexamined emotional residue into sleep and the next morning. Rule 5: Repair within 24 hours. If you reacted poorly, if you said something you wish you hadn't, were unkind when you meant to be direct, withdrew when you should have stayed present, initiate repair within 24 hours. Not a performance of repair. Genuine repair: acknowledge what happened, take ownership of your part, say what you wish you'd done differently, and ask if the other person is okay. This isn't weakness. Research on social bonding and relationship health consistently shows that the capacity to repair after rupture is more important for long-term trust than the absence of rupture in the first place. Rule 6: Weekly avoided emotion writing. Once per week, write about one emotion you've been avoiding. Don't analyze it. Don't try to fix it. Just write it out: what it feels like in the body, what situation seems to be attached to it, what you're afraid would happen if you let yourself fully feel it. The avoided emotion is almost always the one that's doing the most work in the background. Giving it 5 minutes of honest attention once a week is often enough to begin loosening its grip. Regulation technique menu: choose one of the following techniques for week 1. You may expand your repertoire in weeks 2 and 3, but start with one and build mastery of it before adding others. Physiological sigh: the most effective acute technique for reducing sympathetic activation. Double inhale through the nose, a full inhale followed immediately by a short second inhale on top to fully inflate the lungs, then a long, complete exhale through the mouth. The double inhale re-inflates the alveoli in the lungs and significantly increases gas exchange, which amplifies the parasympathetic activation of the exhale. 2 or 3 physiological sighs will noticeably reduce heart rate and the sensation of acute stress within about 30 seconds. Best used at the moment of emotional spike. 5-4-3-2-1 Grounding, for dissociation, overwhelm, or the disconnected drift that sometimes follows intense emotional activation. Name 5 things you can see, 4 you can hear, 3 you can physically touch, 2 you can smell, 1 you can taste. The technique works by redirecting attention to sensory input in the present environment, which interrupts the internally focused processing loop and brings the nervous system back into contact with the actual present moment. Best used when you feel unmoored or disconnected. Cognitive reappraisal, as described in Rule 3, but here applied in the moment. When a difficult emotion arrives, pause, name it, and generate at least 2 genuinely plausible alternative interpretations of the situation before proceeding. The pause and reappraise sequence, practiced enough times, begins to happen faster and eventually becomes a natural part of how you process difficult situations. Body scan and release, for emotions that feel held or suppressed, particularly tension, grief, and unexpressed anger. Sit quietly for 5 minutes, move your attention slowly through your body from feet to head, notice areas of tension or constriction without trying to change them, and then deliberately breathe into them on the inhale and release on the exhale. Not a metaphor, the muscular tension associated with suppressed emotion is real and can be deliberately released through focused attention and breath. Expressive writing, for emotions too complex or too painful to speak aloud, or when there is no trusted person immediately available. James Pennebaker's decades of research on expressive writing show that writing about difficult emotional experiences, specifically including both the facts and the feelings, and doing so for 15 to 20 minutes at a stretch, produces measurable reductions in physiological stress, better immune function, reduced rumination, and improved mood. The writing does not need to be read by anyone. The value is in the externalization of internal experience, not in the product. 3-week structure. Week 1, Foundation. The priority this week is building the morning check-in and the evening reflection as reliable daily habits. Choose one regulation technique and apply it consistently every time your emotional intensity climbs above a 5. Don't worry about doing everything perfectly. The anchor is consistency, the check-in happens, the reflection happens, the technique gets applied when emotions spike. Week 2, Deepening. By now the morning check-in and evening reflection should be established. This week, the emphasis shifts to the reappraisal practice, applying it in real situations, not just in retrospect. And the repair practice comes into focus, actually doing it within 24 hours of a reactive moment, rather than letting the discomfort of having to do it prevent you. Week 2 is where the practice starts to meet real life in more demanding ways. Week 3, Integration. Your technique repertoire can expand this week if the physiological sigh has become reliable. Add a second technique from the menu and practice choosing between them based on the nature of the emotional state. Multiple techniques available and working is the goal. The system is starting to run more automatically. Noticing when it works and being curious about when it doesn't is the week 3 practice. Weekly reflection template. Fill in this template at the end of each day. Brevity is fine, the goal is consistency of reflection, not length. Day. A dominant emotion. Technique used, did it work? Repair made? Key insight: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21. Weekly check-in table at the end of each week. Sit with these 4 questions and record your honest answers. Weak regulation wins. Where did the system work? Reactive moments. What got through? Repairs made. Key learning for next week. At 1, 2, 3. Handling setbacks in the 21-day window. The most common obstacle in a 21-day practice is not lack of motivation, it's the response to setbacks. Most people who start a serious practice like this will have at least 2 or 3 days within the 3 weeks where they don't do the full practice, where they react badly and don't apply the technique, where the repair doesn't happen within 24 hours, or where the week's reflection reveals that the log is mostly empty. This is normal. It is not evidence that the practice doesn't work or that you're incapable of building it. The setback that most disrupts progress is not the missed day. It's the shame spiral that sometimes follows the missed day, the self-criticism that generates its own emotional activation, which then makes the next day's practice feel like an even heavier lift, which increases the likelihood of another miss, which generates more shame. The way to interrupt this sequence is simple and difficult. Treat the setback as data, not verdict. One missed day is a data point. It tells you something, maybe about what conditions make the practice easier or harder, maybe about which practices are more effortful than others, maybe about a specific emotional trigger that derailed you. That information is useful. The shame is not. When you miss something, the only relevant question is, what is the next practice I can do, and how soon can I do it? Not, how do I compensate for what I missed? Not, am I actually capable of this? Just, what is the next action, and what would make it slightly more likely to happen? If you miss 3 or more consecutive days, it's worth a brief reflection on why. Was it a logistical failure? The practice doesn't fit into your day in the way you thought it would? Was it an emotional avoidance? The practice brought up something uncomfortable and you backed away from it? Was it a genuine crisis that legitimately required all your bandwidth? Each of these has a different response. Logistical failures need restructuring of the practice, not recommitment to the original structure. Emotional avoidance needs gentle curiosity about what specifically triggered the retreat. Genuine crises need recovery before the practice resumes, not guilt about the interruption. The goal at the end of 21 days is not a perfect log. It's a changed relationship with your emotional life, a relationship in which you have at least some lived experience of applying regulation techniques successfully, some evidence in your own life that the system can work, and some identification of the specific practices that are most genuinely useful for your particular pattern. Imperfect practice over 21 days produces all of those things. Perfect compliance that doesn't exist in reality produces none of them. What to expect week 1 is the grind. The techniques feel clinical, like you're performing emotional management rather than actually being regulated. The check-ins feel mechanical. You'll forget things. The evening reflection will some nights feel like an obligation rather than a gift. All of this is normal. Skill building always feels clunky before it feels natural. The value of the week is in the consistency, not the elegance. Week 2 is where the shift begins to show up. You'll have at least one moment, probably more, where the technique actually worked. Where you noticed you were about to react, paused, applied the physiological sigh or the reappraisal, and responded differently than you would have a week ago. That moment matters enormously, not just practically but neurologically. It is the brain beginning to encode a new pathway, a new association between emotional activation and regulated response. One real win in week 2 is worth more than a week of smooth sailing. Week 3 is where you start to feel the system becoming yours. The morning check-in starts to feel like genuinely useful information rather than a chore. The techniques are available to you in the moment, not just in retrospect. You begin to notice that you're choosing your response rather than simply discovering what you've already done. This is emotional regulation becoming emotional mastery, the beginning of a fundamentally different relationship with your inner life. 21 days is not the end. It is the point at which the foundation is solid enough to build something lasting on top of. Chapter 9, Level 3, the 30-day emotional architecture. Rebuild. Some emotional patterns don't yield to 7 days of awareness work or 3 weeks of technique practice. Some patterns are structural, woven into the way the nervous system is calibrated, rooted in early experience, maintained by years of reinforcement and avoidance. They don't need a reset. They need a rebuild. This is the most demanding protocol in the book. It asks for 30 consecutive days of genuine commitment, not perfect execution, but genuine sustained effort across practices that go deeper than naming emotions and pausing before you react. It asks you to spend time with the emotions you've been most committed to avoiding. It asks you to do things with your body that most productivity-oriented adults have been persuaded are optional. It asks you to let people in the specific way that your history may have taught you not to do. This is the right level for you if your emotional patterns are deeply ingrained and have persisted across multiple attempts to change them, if the emotional dysregulation you're dealing with is connected to significant early experiences or chronic relational difficulty, if your relationship with your own emotional life is characterized more by combat than by navigation, Or if you've done levels 1 and 2 and reached a ceiling that you sense requires something more substantial. A note that matters: if you are working with trauma, PTSD, severe depression, or other conditions that require clinical care, please engage professional support alongside this protocol. This is not a substitute for therapy. It is a structured practice that can complement therapeutic work, but it is not equipped to handle what clinical mental health care is designed for. If you're in that category, please get both. 8 core daily practices. These are not optional. The whole system depends on all 8 running simultaneously. Each individual practice has value, but the transformation this protocol produces comes from their interaction, from what happens when you build somatic awareness alongside cognitive reappraisal, alongside social connection, alongside nervous system regulation through movement. The research basis for each is real. The integration is where the architecture actually changes. Practice 1: Morning Somatic Check-in. Before any devices, before your phone, before email, before anything that brings the outside world in, spend 5 minutes with your body. A body scan from feet to head, moving slowly, noticing the quality of sensation in each region. What's tight? What's heavy? What's activated? What's open? This is your body's emotional report, the physical registration of what your nervous system is carrying before the day's stimulation layers on top of it. Learn to read it. The body knows what you feel before the mind does, and its report is honest in a way the mind's can sometimes not be. Practice 2: Mindfulness Meditation, 20 minutes daily. Not focused attention on the breath as a relaxation technique, though that will be in effect. Specifically, observing emotions as they arise and pass in your field of awareness, without acting on them or suppressing them. Sitting with the feeling of anxiety, for instance, and watching what it does, where it lives in the body, how it moves, whether it intensifies or diminishes when you simply observe it without adding anything. This is the practice of decoupling emotional experience from behavioral response at the deepest level. 20 minutes is the dose that research suggests produces measurable change in neural structure and function. 10 minutes is better than nothing, 20 is the target. Practice 3: Emotion Journaling, 10 minutes daily. For each significant emotional experience of the day, write 4 things: the emotion itself, named as precisely as possible, the story the emotion is attached to, what happened, what it meant, the body location and physical quality of the emotion, and what you believe the emotion is actually communicating, beneath the surface. Story. This 4th element is the most important and the hardest. Emotions are signals. Anxiety is often communicating, I care deeply about something that feels uncertain. Anger is often communicating, something important to me has been violated. Grief is communicating, I have loved something I no longer have. Getting to the real message, rather than staying at the level of the story, is the deepest work. Practice 4: Reappraisal Practice with 3 alternatives. Each day, take the most challenging emotional moment and generate 3 genuinely alternative interpretations, not forced positivity, but real cognitive flexibility. Make yourself find 3. The third one is often the most useful, because it's the one you have to work for, the one your mind didn't generate automatically. 3 alternatives to your default reading of a situation builds the habit of holding your interpretations lightly, of recognizing that the meaning you assign to events is a construction, not a discovery. Practice 5: Movement, 30 minutes daily. This is not a wellness suggestion. This is a neurological intervention. Exercise directly modulates the nervous system through multiple mechanisms. It metabolizes the stress hormones, adrenaline and cortisol, that are mobilized by emotional activation but rarely fully discharged in modern life. It increases BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which supports neuroplasticity, the actual physical rewiring of the brain. It reliably improves mood through endorphin and serotonin pathways, and it reduces the background level of physiological arousal that makes emotional dysregulation more likely. You cannot emotion regulate your way to a calm nervous system if the nervous system is chronically overloaded with unmetabolized stress hormones. You have to move. Practice 6: Sleep Protocol. Emotional consolidation, threat recalibration, and the neural processing of difficult experiences happen during REM sleep. People who are chronically sleep-deprived show measurably increased amygdala reactivity, reduced prefrontal regulation, and greater emotional volatility. You cannot do serious emotional architecture work on insufficient sleep. The protocol: consistent sleep and wake times every day including weekends, no screens for 30 minutes before bed, sleeping environment dark and cool, alcohol eliminated or minimized. It suppresses REM, and a recognition that the 30 days of this protocol will be significantly undermined if sleep is not taken seriously. Practice 7. Relationship practice: share one genuine emotion daily. Tell one person you trust one real thing about your emotional experience today. Not a complaint, not a performance, a genuine disclosure. I was really anxious about the conversation with my manager this morning. I felt a wave of sadness today that I couldn't fully explain. I'm noticing I'm scared about how this is going and I haven't said that to anyone. This practice works because the deepest work of emotional regulation happens in relationship, through co-regulation, through the experience of being witnessed without being judged, through the nervous system learning that emotional honesty does not lead to abandonment. If there's currently no one in your life you trust enough for this, that fact is itself important information, and building one such relationship over the course of this month is part of the protocol. Practice 8. Weekly pattern review. Once per week, read the full week's journal entries and reflection notes and look for patterns across the 7 days. What keeps triggering you? What emotions are appearing most consistently? What situations are your nervous system finding most challenging? What progress is visible that you might not notice day to day? The weekly review is where you develop understanding rather than just experience, where the data of your emotional life turns into self-knowledge. For week structure: Week 1, withdrawal. The first week of serious emotional work often feels like a kind of withdrawal. You're reducing or eliminating inputs that had been serving as emotional numbing mechanisms: chronic screen use, alcohol, constant background noise and stimulation, the busyness that prevents contact with your own inner life. When those buffers come down, the emotions they were muffling begin to surface. This is supposed to happen. It is not a sign that something is wrong. You may feel more irritable, more tired, more sensitive, more emotionally raw than you expected. The rawness means the work is actually beginning. Week 2, the fog lifting. By the second week, the most destabilizing effects of week 1 typically begin to ease. The emotions that surfaced are starting to differentiate. Instead of a general feeling of emotional overwhelm or rawness, you're beginning to identify what specifically is there. The anxiety is becoming distinguishable from the grief. The irritability has a name and an origin. The fog of vague emotional distress begins to lift into something more specific and, paradoxically, more workable. Specific emotions can be processed. Undifferentiated emotional overwhelm cannot. Week 3, rebuild. Something shifts in week 3 for most people who have followed the protocol consistently. Regulation becomes more reliable. You find yourself staying present in situations that would have overwhelmed you 2 weeks ago. The meditation is less of a discipline and more of a genuine resource, the 30 minutes before the day begins to feel like something you actually want rather than something you're doing because you committed to it. The relationship practice starts producing moments of genuine connection that feel different from what you're used to. The architecture is beginning to change. Week 4, new architecture. The final week is about consolidation and recognition. You're integrating what you've built. You're beginning to identify what needs to continue beyond the 30 days, which practices have become genuinely important to you, which ones you'll maintain, what the long-term version of this looks like. And you're taking honest stock of what has changed. It will not be everything. The patterns that took decades to form don't fully dissolve in a month. But the relationship with your emotional life, the basic quality of how you stand in relation to what you feel, will be genuinely different. Most people who complete this protocol describe the change as less war and more conversation. Less being at the mercy of their inner world and more being in a working relationship with it. Emergency protocol for moments of emotional flooding: when the activation is too intense to regulate in any of the usual ways, when you are overwhelmed in a way that feels ungovernable. First, physical safety. If you are in a situation or a conversation that is intensifying the flooding, remove yourself. Leave the room. Step outside. The flooding cannot be processed while the triggering situation is still actively happening. Second, the physiological sigh, 5 times. Each time, double inhale through the nose, long complete exhale through the mouth. This is the fastest physiological tool for reducing acute sympathetic activation. Do 5. Don't skip this step. Third, cold water on the wrists and face for 5 minutes. The diving reflex, the body's automatic response to cold water on the face, activates the vagus nerve and reduces heart rate. This is not folk wisdom, it is a genuine physiological mechanism that works even in states of high arousal. Fourth, write one sentence, I feel because. This single act of naming and locating the emotion begins to engage the prefrontal cortex and interrupts the loop of pure physiological flooding. One sentence. Not an essay. Just the emotion and the trigger, written in plain language. That's enough for now. The role of professional support. This protocol is designed to be used independently, you don't need a therapist or coach to run it. But it's worth being explicit about when adding professional support would significantly increase its value, and when it would be essentially required. If what you're carrying includes experiences that you would categorize as traumatic events that still generate strong physiological responses when you think about them, that intrude into consciousness involuntarily, that cause you to avoid people or places or situations as a way of managing the activation they create, the standard emotion regulation techniques in this protocol will be of limited effectiveness for those specific experiences. Trauma processing requires specific approaches: EMDR, somatic experiencing, certain trauma-focused CBT protocols that go beyond what this book covers. The practices here can be genuinely helpful as stabilization and daily maintenance, but the core trauma material benefits from professional processing. If you are currently in a major depressive episode, not a period of low mood or sadness, but the kind of depression that significantly impairs daily functioning, involves persistent low mood across most of the day for most days, and includes either worthlessness/guilt, difficulty concentrating, changes in sleep and appetite, or thoughts of death or self-harm, please seek clinical care before or alongside this protocol. Depression alters the functioning of the very neural systems this protocol relies on: motivation, attention, memory, cognitive flexibility, and without appropriate treatment, the protocol's demands may exceed the capacity available. If you're a high-functioning person who has never had clinical depression or trauma but who has deeply ingrained patterns that you've tried to change before without lasting success, this protocol is exactly what it's designed for. Many people in this category benefit significantly from doing it alongside coaching or therapy, not because they couldn't do it alone, but because the accountability, the skilled reflection, and the co-regulation that a good therapeutic relationship provides genuinely accelerate the process. But they are also fully capable of meaningful change through this protocol independently. The honest note is this: the deeper the patterns and the more they're rooted in early experience, the more support the process benefits from. Not everyone can or will access professional support, and the lack of access is not a reason to forego this work. But if support is available and accessible to you, the 30-day rebuild is an excellent context in which to use it. Social and work navigation. Maintaining emotional regulation under professional and social pressure requires specific strategies that go beyond the individual daily practices. In professional settings during this month, communicate less reactively by pausing before responding to anything that activates you. Use the physiological sigh, then respond. Manage high-stakes conversations by doing the morning somatic check-in specifically with that conversation in mind, noting your anticipatory emotional state before entering the situation. After difficult professional interactions, use the journaling practice to process rather than ruminate. In family and close social systems, your changing emotional patterns will affect those around you, sometimes in ways that are temporarily disruptive. People who have adapted to your old patterns, who knew how to navigate your reactivity or your suppression, may find the new version of you surprising and even, briefly, uncomfortable. This is normal and does not mean you're doing something wrong. Continue the practices and give the people around you time to adjust. What to expect? The first 2 weeks often involve an unexpected emotion: grief. People who have spent years or decades in emotional suppression, numbness, or reactivity often carry a backlog of unfelt emotions from experiences that were never properly processed. When you create the conditions for that backlog to be felt, through consistent practice, reduced numbing inputs, genuine attention, some of what surfaces is old. You may feel sadness or loss that doesn't quite attach to anything current. You may find yourself unexpectedly moved by things that wouldn't normally affect you. This is not breakdown. It is the beginning of the processing that was interrupted. The grief is the backlog clearing. It is necessary and, despite being difficult, is a sign that the work is working. By week 3, most people report a paradox: they are feeling more than they were before, more intensity, more range, more contact with their emotional life, but they are suffering less. The emotions are no longer backed up, no longer building pressure in the background, no longer leaking sideways into behavior and relationships in ways that couldn't be explained or controlled. They are moving through. And moving through, it turns out, is what emotions are designed to do. By the end of 30 days, the architecture is different. Not finished emotional development doesn't finish, but genuinely restructured in the ways that matter most: faster recovery from dysregulation, more accurate awareness, broader repertoire of regulated response, deeper capacity for genuine connection, and something that is hard to describe but that people consistently name as more like peace. Chapter 10: Sustaining Emotional Mastery. Completing a protocol is not the same as changing a pattern. You've probably experienced this in other areas of life. The training period ends, the structured commitment concludes, and within weeks or months, the old habits are quietly reasserting themselves. Not because you weren't sincere. Not because the work didn't matter. But because maintaining a change requires a different kind of structure than making the change less intensive, more sustainable, built for years rather than weeks, designed to survive the disruptions that life reliably delivers. This chapter is about building that structure. It's about the practices, frameworks, and awareness habits that keep the gains from the previous 3 chapters from slowly dissolving back into the emotional patterns they replaced. And it's about recognizing, honestly, that this is a lifelong relationship. Emotional mastery is not a destination. It is a direction. The person who has practiced for 3 years is not finished with the work, they have a better relationship with it. That is the actual prize. The green-yellow-red framework, the simplest and most practically useful tool for long-term emotional maintenance, is a personal monitoring system that tells you, at a glance, where your emotional regulation is currently operating. Think of it as a dashboard, not a judgment, but a readout. Green zone is your baseline functioning at its best. In the green zone, your emotions are being named and felt with reasonable accuracy. Your regulation techniques are working when you use them. Your relationships feel responsive, there's genuine connection, not just surface management. You have access to your full cognitive capacity, your creativity, your patience. You sleep adequately and wake with some degree of energy. Difficult things are happening, life always provides those, but you're navigating them with your full capacity available. Green zone is not the absence of difficulty. It's the presence of adequate capacity to meet difficulty without dysregulation. Yellow zone is the zone of early warning. In the yellow zone, things are starting to slip but haven't broken down yet. Reactive incidents are increasing in frequency: more snapping, more defensiveness, more moments of "that wasn't me at my best." Suppression patterns are returning. You're noticing that you're not processing things but are instead pushing them aside, and the pile is growing. Your emotional vocabulary is contracting. You're back to fine and stressed because the more precise access requires a quality of attention you're not currently giving. The practices are getting irregular, the check-ins are skipping, the journaling is sparse, the things that keep the system running are quietly deprioritized as other demands increase. Yellow zone is not crisis. It is the runway before crisis. Catching it here is enormously easier and less costly than letting it proceed to red. Red zone is full dysregulation. Relationships are deteriorating because the emotional patterns have become too disruptive or too withdrawn for genuine connection to persist. The body is registering the accumulated stress, persistent physical symptoms, disrupted sleep, diminished energy. The cognitive effects of chronic emotional dysregulation are visible: difficulty concentrating, poor decision-making, diminished creativity, a sense of overwhelm that doesn't lift. The practices have largely stopped. The coping mechanisms that the work helped reduce: overconsumption of alcohol, numbing screen use, compulsive work, have reasserted themselves or intensified. Red zone requires the kind of response described in the Level 3 protocol: a serious, sustained reinvestment in the practices, and probably external support. The most important thing to understand about this framework is that movement between zones is normal. You will not remain in green zone continuously. Life will periodically move you toward yellow, through loss, through sustained stress, through relationship difficulty, through the ordinary wear of a demanding life. The measure of long-term success is not staying in green. It is recognizing yellow early and responding before it becomes red. The 4-stage relapse pattern. Understanding how dysregulation returns is the key to preventing it. The return of old emotional patterns almost never happens suddenly. It follows a sequence that, once recognized, is eminently interruptible. Stage 1 is stress spike. A major life event, a loss, a professional crisis, a significant relationship rupture, a health scare, a major change activates the emotional system at intensity levels it hasn't experienced since before the work began. The event itself is not the problem. The stress spike is a normal response to an abnormal demand. Stage 2 avoidance. Under the elevated stress of stage 1, the practices that require time, attention, and emotional contact begin to feel too demanding. The journaling stops. The check-ins disappear. The meditation is abandoned. The relationship practice, sharing genuine emotions with a trusted person, feels too vulnerable when you're already overwhelmed. The practices are dropped not through any decision to abandon them but through the gradual, understandable prioritization of immediate demands over long-term maintenance. This is the critical window. The practices are most needed precisely when they feel most difficult to do. Stage 3 numbing. With the practices gone, the accumulated emotional activation has no constructive outlet. Default coping mechanisms return: the extra drink, the hours of passive screen consumption, the escalated work obsession, the withdrawal from social connection, the food that wasn't about hunger. These behaviors work, in the short term, for the purpose they're being used for. They numb. But they also prevent the emotional processing that would allow the stress to actually metabolize, which means the underlying activation continues to build. Stage 4 explosion or collapse. The accumulated pressure finds its exit. The explosion is familiar, a reactive episode of intensity that surprises even the person having it. The collapse is quieter but equally significant, a withdrawal from engagement, a loss of motivation or effect, a shutdown that can feel like depression. Either way, the old pattern has fully reasserted itself, and the recovery work is substantially more demanding than it would have been if the yellow zone had been caught. Knowing this pattern does not make you immune to it. It makes you better able to recognize which stage you're in and respond before the sequence completes. The 333 monthly check once a month, ideally on a consistent date, like the first of the month or the first Sunday. Spend 20 to 30 minutes with these 9 questions. Write the answers, even briefly. The writing matters because it forces precision. 3 wins. Where is your emotional regulation strongest this month? Where have you handled something difficult well, stayed present, responded rather than reacted, processed something you'd previously have buried or exploded with? Name 3 specific instances or patterns. This is not self-congratulation. It is reinforcement of the neural pathways associated with effective regulation. The brain strengthens what it attends to. 3 gaps. Where are you still getting hijacked? What situations, people, or emotional states are still consistently getting through your regulation capacity? What's the pattern in the reactive moments? Is there a common trigger, a common emotional state underneath the reaction, a common time of day or context? Be honest. The gaps are not evidence of failure. They are the map for the next month's focus. 3 practices. What would most support you this month? Based on the wins and gaps you've identified, what 3 practices or intentions would be most useful in the coming month? These might be existing practices you want to reinstate, a new technique to try, a relationship repair to make, a conversation to have, or a lifestyle factor to address. Specific and practical beats vague and aspirational. I will do the physiological sigh immediately whenever I notice my intensity climbing above a 6 is more useful than I want to be less reactive. Trigger seasons. Certain periods in life are reliably high risk for emotional dysregulation, not because of any failure of character or commitment, but because the conditions during these periods systematically increase the demands on the regulatory system while often simultaneously reducing the capacity to meet them. Grief of any kind, the loss of a person, a relationship, a life stage, a role, generates sustained emotional activation that depletes regulatory resources over time. The practices need to be increased during grief, not abandoned, even though grief makes it harder to do them. The physiological sigh becomes more important, not less. The journaling becomes more important. The relationship contact becomes more important. Romantic conflict, particularly in long-term intimate relationships, activates attachment systems and threat responses simultaneously, creating some of the most intense and most challenging emotional terrain adults navigate. During periods of sustained relationship difficulty, the co-regulation that the relationship normally provides is disrupted, which means you're navigating heightened emotional activation with reduced access to one of your primary regulatory resources. Individual practices become more important to compensate. Financial stress chronically activates the threat response system. The uncertainty, scarcity, and loss of agency associated with financial difficulty generates sustained cortisol elevation that reduces the window of tolerance and makes emotional dysregulation more likely in all areas of life. Exercise becomes especially important. The cortisol needs somewhere to go. Health changes, your own or those of someone close to you, bring confrontation with mortality, loss of control, and often significant practical disruption. The emotional work during health crises tends to be the avoidance work. The emotions that health challenges surface, fear, grief, helplessness, are often the ones most deeply ingrained as off-limits. Family gatherings, particularly those that involve complex or unresolved relational histories, are reliably activating for most people. Old attachment dynamics resurface. Old patterns reassert themselves in the presence of the people who were there when the patterns were formed. Planning deliberately for these events, knowing in advance that your nervous system will be more challenged, preparing your regulation tools, building in recovery time afterward is not excessive. It is practical. Environmental design. Emotional mastery doesn't happen in a vacuum. The environment you inhabit, physical, digital, and social, has constant influence on your nervous system's baseline state and therefore on your regulation capacity. Designing that environment deliberately is not a luxury. It is part of the practice. Physical environment. Create a space in your home that is specifically associated with emotional processing work, where you journal, where you meditate, where you sit for the morning check-in. The consistency of location supports the habit through context-dependent memory. When you go to that space, your nervous system recognizes the context and begins to prepare for the internal attention the practice requires. A walking route serves a similar function, a regular path that your body knows as the place where thinking and feeling happen. Digital environment. Reduce inputs that systematically increase your baseline emotional arousal. News platforms designed for engagement through outrage, social media feeds calibrated to maximize anxiety and comparison, video content that activates and doesn't resolve. All of these are continuous low-level inputs to your nervous system that accumulate across a day. This isn't about becoming uninformed or disengaged from the world. It's about being deliberate about what emotional activation you're importing and at what volume. Audit your digital diet with the same seriousness you'd audit your food. Social environment. Invest in relationships where emotional honesty is genuinely safe, where you can say I'm struggling and be met with presence rather than advice, discomfort, or dismissal. These relationships are not common, and they require cultivation. The time spent building them is among the highest return investments available in the project of long-term emotional well-being. Simultaneously, manage your exposure to relationships that are chronically high arousal without resolution, people whose emotional patterns consistently trigger your dysregulation and who are unwilling to do anything about it. When old patterns return, what to do? Old patterns return. This is not a personal failure, it is a neurological reality. The neural pathways associated with old emotional patterns don't disappear when new ones are built alongside them. They go quiet, suppressed by the more frequently activated new pathways, but they remain structurally present. Under conditions of high stress, reduced sleep, significant loss, or any sustained pressure that depletes regulatory resources, the older pathways can become active again. You may find yourself reacting in ways you thought you'd moved past. You may find the suppression returning, the rumination reasserting itself, the emotional disconnection settling back in like an old coat. When this happens, the first thing to do is recognize it without catastrophizing. Returning to an old pattern does not mean the work you've done was wasted or that change wasn't real. It means you're in a period of depletion or high demand, and the system is reverting to its more deeply encoded defaults. This is information, not verdict. The second thing is to triage. Not everything needs to come back simultaneously. Look at your current practices and identify the one that has slipped most and that would be most stabilizing to reinstate. For most people, this is some version of the morning check-in or basic sleep hygiene, the foundational practices that support everything else. Start there. Not the full 21-day protocol, not a complete restart, just the one most stabilizing practice, reinstated consistently for a week. The third thing is to increase connection. The return of dysregulation is also the moment when the urge to isolate is strongest, to withdraw, to manage alone, to not burden others with what's happening. This urge, while understandable, is neurologically counterproductive. Co-regulation is most needed precisely when self-regulation has been most depleted. Reaching toward a trusted person, not to perform being okay, but to genuinely share that things are harder right now, is not weakness. It is the most sophisticated emotional intelligence move available. Finally, be honest with yourself about whether the return of old patterns signals a yellow zone moment that the standard maintenance can handle, or a red zone situation that requires a more substantial response. The four-stage relapse pattern described earlier is the map. Which stage are you in? The answer determines the appropriate response: some additional attention and reinstated practices for yellow, a full-scale re-engagement with level 3 protocol and probably professional support for red. The return of old patterns becomes easier to navigate the more times you've navigated it. The second time you recognize the pattern and respond effectively, the recovery is faster. The third time, faster still. The skill being built is not the permanent elimination of old patterns, it is the speed and quality of the recovery. That skill compounds. Year 3 looks genuinely different from year 1, not because the old patterns are gone, but because the relationship with them has fundamentally changed. Annual reset once per year, return to the level 1 protocol for 7 days. Not because you've failed or regressed, but because the practice of fresh, deliberate attention to your emotional life reveals things that have accumulated below the level of ongoing awareness, the emotions being quietly avoided, the patterns that have solidified without your noticing, the areas of emotional life that have narrowed while your attention was elsewhere. The annual 7-day awareness practice is a recalibration. What are the emotions you haven't been letting yourself feel this year? What suppression has quietly returned? What have you been too busy or too committed to other priorities to process? Where has the emotional vocabulary contracted? The recalibration answers these questions and gives you honest information about where the next year's emotional work should focus. This is not a failure protocol. It is a maintenance protocol. The most emotionally healthy people, those who have built genuine mastery over years of practice, still do deliberate check-ins on their practice, still notice when things drift, still return to the basics when life has pushed them away from them. The commitment to this kind of honest, ongoing relationship with your emotional life is, in the end, what emotional mastery actually is. The compound interest of emotional practice. One of the most encouraging things that the research on long-term emotional development shows is that the work compounds over time in ways that aren't visible in the early stages. During the first weeks of practice, most of what you're doing is getting the foundation in place, the awareness, the vocabulary, the basic regulation skills. The gains feel small and sometimes provisional. You regulate once and then fail to regulate 3 times, and it's hard to see meaningful progress. This is normal and it is temporary. The compounding begins quietly. A year into consistent practice, you will handle situations that would have dysregulated you completely 18 months earlier without a second thought, not because you've suppressed the response, but because your window of tolerance has genuinely expanded and the situation no longer pushes you above it. A skill that took enormous deliberate effort at month 1 is automatic by month 12. The practices that required willpower become something closer to preference. And the recovery time from genuine reactive moments, the time between the episode and the return to regulatory baseline, shortens meaningfully across the months and years. What took 3 days of shame and residual activation takes 3 hours. What took 3 hours takes 30 minutes. This trajectory is not uniform. It is not a straight line upward. There are plateaus and there are setbacks. But the general direction, maintained across consistent practice, is unmistakable. The person who has practiced for 3 years inhabits their emotional life differently from the person who started yesterday. And the distance between those two versions of the same person is exactly the compound interest of the small daily choices, the check-ins, the practices, the repairs accumulated across time. What to expect emotional mastery over the long term looks different from what most people imagine when they begin the work. It does not look like serenity. It does not look like the absence of difficult emotions or the permanent transcendence of reactivity. What it looks like is faster recovery and deeper understanding each time a difficult emotional moment occurs. It looks like the reactive episode that used to take days to recover from now taking hours. The suppression that used to be invisible is now visible within the same day. The rumination that used to run for weeks now winds down within a day or two. The disconnection that used to be the default has been replaced by a working, if imperfect, ability to know what you're feeling. The measure of success is not 0 reactive moments. It is the relationship with each reactive moment that follows. Can you see it, name it, understand what drove it, make repair where needed, and take something useful from it? That capacity to learn from your emotional life rather than just be shaped by it is what sustained practice produces. And it is, in every way that matters, a different kind of life. Conclusion: the intelligence you were never taught. Picture someone sitting alone in the early evening. It might be you. The room is quiet, the kind of quiet that feels full rather than empty, the kind that doesn't need to be filled. Something difficult arrived today, a conversation that didn't go the way they hoped, or a wave of grief for something that hasn't quite been spoken yet, or a slow building fear about the future that crested this afternoon while they were doing something completely ordinary. And instead of immediately reaching for the phone, or turning on a program, or pouring a drink, or working until the feeling recedes, they sat down with it. Not to fix it. Not to analyze it into the ground. Just to be with it. To let it be real. And in that sitting, in that honest contact with what's actually there, something shifted. Not resolved, not disappeared, but moved. The wave rolled through instead of pressing behind a dam. The feeling was heard by the only person who could truly hear it, the person having it. And when they finally stood up, 10 minutes later, they felt lighter, not because the difficulty was gone, but because the difficulty was no longer being carried alone by a body that couldn't speak and a mind that refused to listen. This is not a dramatic image. It is one of the most ordinary-looking acts of human courage available. What changes when emotion becomes information? Most people spend a substantial portion of their lives in an adversarial relationship with their own emotional experience. The feelings that arrive uninvited, the anxiety at 3 a.m., the anger that doesn't quite match the situation, the grief that resurfaces years after it should have resolved, the ache of loneliness in the middle of a crowded room are experienced as interruptions. As problems. As evidence that something is wrong, or that you are somehow failing at the task of being a functional adult. The premise of this book has been different. Emotions are not interruptions. They are information. They are your nervous system's best current attempt to communicate what's happening inside you, what matters to you, what threatens you, what you need, what you've lost, what you want. They are not always accurate. They are not always proportionate. They carry the noise of old learning and outdated predictions alongside whatever is genuinely relevant to the present moment. But they are always communicating something, and refusing to listen doesn't silence the signal. It just means the signal finds other ways out. When you shift from an adversarial relationship with your emotional life to an informational one, when the question stops being "how do I get rid of this feeling?" and starts being "what is this feeling telling me?" the quality of your inner life changes fundamentally. Anxiety becomes a signal worth listening to rather than an enemy to be overcome. Anger reveals what you value and what you feel has been violated. Grief confirms what you loved. Fear points toward what matters enough to be worth protecting. Even the flat emptiness of emotional numbness, when you can sit with it honestly, often reveals the suppressed weight of things that haven't been let in. This doesn't make difficult emotions easier to have. It makes them meaningful. And meaning, it turns out, is its own kind of relief. The competence of a person who knows their own inner world. There is a particular quality visible in people who have done serious emotional work, who have spent real time developing their capacity to know and navigate their own inner life. It's not what you might expect. It doesn't look like emotional expressiveness, necessarily. It doesn't look like effortless calm. It doesn't look like the performed serenity of someone who has decided that equanimity is a personal brand. It looks like presence. They are fully there in a conversation, not partially there while managing some background thread of anxiety about how they're coming across. When something moves them, they allow it to move them, without being destabilized by the movement. When something angers them, the anger is proportionate, communicative, and doesn't become the whole of who they are in that moment. When someone else is in distress, they can be close to it, genuinely close, not managing the situation from behind glass, without being dissolved by it. They can disagree without it becoming an emergency. They can receive criticism without it becoming an identity threat. They can sit with uncertainty without needing to immediately convert it into false certainty. They can be wrong and update, rather than defend a position past the point of sense. They can love someone without losing themselves, be affected without being consumed. This is not transcendence. It is a kind of groundedness, a center of gravity that doesn't shift every time the emotional weather changes. The emotions still come. The difficulty still arrives. But the person is not at the mercy of it. They are in conversation with it. And that conversation, conducted honestly over years, produces something that looks from the outside like wisdom, and feels from the inside like finally being at home in your own life. The unexpected gifts of this work. There are things that change as a result of this work that don't make it into the marketing pitch, the things that can't be captured in a list of benefits or a before and after transformation story. They're subtler than that, and they're probably more important. One of them is the relationship with your own past. When you begin to understand your emotional patterns, where they came from, what they were trying to do, how they made sense in their original context, something changes in how you relate to the difficult parts of your history. Not a sentimental forgiveness narrative. Something quieter and more honest, a recognition that you did what made sense with what you had. The person who developed a reactive pattern in a home where emotions were volatile and unpredictable was making a reasonable adaptation to an unreasonable environment. The person who developed suppression in a family where emotional expression was unwelcome or punished was protecting themselves intelligently. The intelligence of those adaptations doesn't make them appropriate for the current moment, but it does make them understandable in a way that softens the harsh self-judgment many people carry about their own emotional failures. Another gift, less expected, is access to a wider range of experience. Most people who struggle significantly with their emotional lives are operating with a narrowed range, not just the difficult emotions, but the positive ones too. Suppression doesn't selectively contain only sadness and fear. It blunts the whole spectrum. Reactivity doesn't only amplify anger, it keeps the system at a chronic level of vigilance that makes genuine enjoyment, genuine rest, genuine absorption in beauty or pleasure harder to access. When the system begins to regulate more effectively, people often report that they feel more, not less, but that what they feel includes more of the full range. More genuine joy. More real delight. More capacity for the kind of presence that makes ordinary experience vivid. This is not a side effect of the work. In some sense, it is the work. A third unexpected gift is changed relationships with people you haven't changed. When you change how you show up emotionally, when you stop being reactive in the ways that made others guard themselves, or stop being suppressed in the ways that made genuine connection impossible, the people in your life begin to respond differently to you. Not always, not immediately, not all of them. But the change in your emotional patterns changes the social environment around you, because you are a node in other people's nervous systems, and when your node changes, the network shifts. Some relationships will deepen in ways that weren't possible before. Some that were functional but thin will develop texture. Some that were structured around your old patterns and require those patterns to continue as they were, those may change in more complicated ways. But the net effect, for most people who do this work seriously, is a social world that feels more genuinely available. The long arc, the understanding in this book was never going to change everything overnight. Real change in the emotional system is measured in months and years, not days. The brain rewires slowly, and the patterns that have been running for decades don't yield to a single week of practice or even a single month of serious effort. What they yield to is the kind of sustained, imperfect, honest engagement that treats emotional development not as a project with a completion date but as a relationship that continues. Every conversation you manage to have with greater presence than the last one. Every moment you catch the reactive impulse before it becomes action, even if you don't catch the next three. Every time you name an emotion instead of acting it out. Every repair you make after a rupture. Every honest conversation with someone you trust. Every morning you begin with some awareness of your own internal state rather than immediately importing the world's noise. All of it accumulates. All of it is real. The gap between the person you were at the beginning of this book and the person who will close it is probably wider than you can fully perceive right now. The changes that result from genuine engagement with this material tend to reveal themselves gradually and then suddenly, in the interaction that goes differently than it would have before, in the emotion you navigate without damage, in the relationship that deepens in ways you didn't think possible, in the quiet morning where you notice you're actually okay. That noticing is not a small thing. For many people, after years of difficulty with their own inner life, actually being okay, not performing okay, not managing okay, but genuinely resting in a state of emotional adequacy is a new experience. It is the thing the work was for. The relationship with difficulty. There's a specific quality that develops in people who have done serious emotional work and sustained it over time, a quality in their relationship with difficulty that is different from either avoidance or forced acceptance. The best word for it might be willingness, the genuine willingness to be present with whatever arises, not because it's pleasant, but because the alternative, the chronic effort of keeping difficult experience at arm's length, costs more than presence does. This willingness is not resignation. It is not passivity. A person who is willing to feel their grief is not indifferent to the loss that caused it. A person who is willing to sit with anxiety is not failing to address the things that generate it. Willingness is the recognition that the emotion itself, the feeling, in the body, in the moment, is not the enemy. The enemy was always the distance, the numbing, the avoiding, the suppressing, the racing away from the feeling before it could tell you what it knew. Difficult emotions, fully felt, are almost always shorter than the effort required to avoid them. The anxiety about the conversation is more exhausting than the conversation. The anticipatory dread of the grief is worse than the grief that arrives when you let it. The shame held at arm's length grows, the shame looked at directly and without judgment tends to dissolve into something more like understanding. Emotions are designed to move. When they're allowed to move, they do. The person who has developed this willingness, who has built the capacity to be present with their own inner weather without immediately needing to change it, has access to something rare, the full data of their own emotional life. Not just the acceptable feelings, not just the emotions that confirm the story they prefer to tell about themselves, but the whole of it. The fear alongside the confidence. The grief alongside the love. The anger alongside the care. And from that whole, honest inner landscape, they make better decisions, form deeper connections, and live a life that is more genuinely theirs. What was never taught you came into a world that was almost entirely unprepared to give you what you actually needed most, an accurate map of your own inner life, the language to navigate it, and the community of people willing to do that navigation honestly alongside you. Instead, you received messages, some explicit, most absorbed through observation, about what emotions were safe to have and which were inconvenient. You learned which feelings were supposed to be hidden and which were permitted. You watched the adults around you handle difficulty in the ways they'd been taught, which were often the ways they'd inherited without examination, which were often not good ways at all. And you built your emotional patterns from what was available to you, without any map, without any real instruction, doing your best with what you had. This is not a story of blame. It's a story of context. The people who shaped your early emotional world were also operating without adequate guidance, also navigating the gap between the complexity of inner life and the poverty of the education they'd received about it. The pattern goes back further than any of us, through generations of people who suffered in similar ways and passed similar silence forward. That chain ends when someone decides to actually learn what was never taught. It ends when someone takes seriously the idea that their emotional life is worth attention, not just when it becomes a crisis, not just when it's causing enough damage that it can't be ignored, but as an ongoing part of what it means to live thoughtfully and well. That is what you've done by engaging with this material. That is what you continue to do every time you return to the practices, every time you choose awareness over avoidance, every time you stay with the difficult feeling long enough to hear what it's actually saying. The most important skill nobody ever taught you is the one you're now building. It changes you. And in the specific, quiet, invisible way that one person's expanded emotional capacity changes those around them, through co-regulation, through genuine presence, through the conversations that become possible when someone is truly there, it changes everyone you're in contact with. There is a person sitting with a difficult emotion in the early evening, in a quiet room. And instead of running from it, they stay. They let it be real. They listen to what it has to say. That person is practicing one of the most important things a human being can practice. And the practice, however imperfect, however intermittent, however slowly it builds, is enough. It is more than enough. It is the work.